Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into shadows and secrets, into a world where women whispered the future in candlelit corners while kingdoms trembled at their words. Imagine this, a cold medieval night, somewhere in England, 1563. A noblewoman slips through the darkness, her silk cloak pulled tight against the wind. She is not going to church, she is not visiting family. She is seeking a woman the world calls dangerous, heretical, unholy, a woman who sees tomorrow. Why would a lady of high birth risk everything, her reputation, her safety, her very soul, to knock on the door of a fortune teller? And why, in an age when men controlled nearly everything, did women alone hold this strange, terrifying power to glimpse what had not yet come to pass? Tonight, you will discover the answer, and I promise you, it is far more fascinating than you ever imagined. So before we step together into this hidden world, I would love it if you could help this channel grow. If you find yourself captivated by what unfolds tonight, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, or share it with someone who loves a good mystery. And I am genuinely curious. Where are you watching from right now? Your bedroom, a quiet living room? Maybe you are halfway across the world listening under the stars. Drop a comment below and let me know. I read every single one, and your words truly make my day. Now, dim the lights if you can. Maybe turn on a fan for that gentle, soothing hum. Get comfortable. Let your mind settle. Because tonight, we are traveling back in time. Back to an era when the future was not something you Googled, it was something you bought from a woman with knowing eyes and calloused hands. Are you ready? Let us begin. Close your eyes for a moment and picture medieval Europe. Not the romanticized version with knights and maidens dancing at banquets. No, picture the real thing. Mud, disease, uncertainty. Life was short, brutal, and utterly unpredictable. You did not know if your child would survive the winter. You did not know if your crops would fail. You did not know if the man you loved would come home from war. The future was a terrifying void, and human beings, then as now, could not bear not knowing. So they turned to the only people who claimed to have answers. Women, not priests, not scholars, women. Old women in cottages at the edge of the village, young women with strange, piercing gazes, widows who lived alone and grew herbs that smelled like secrets. These were the fortune tellers, the seers, the cunning folk, and they were everywhere. Here is what fascinates me most. In a society that told women to be silent, obedient, invisible, fortune-telling was one of the very few ways a woman could have power. Real power, the kind that made people cross themselves and whisper her name. Think about that. A peasant woman who could barely read might have nobles showing up at her door with gold coins, begging her to tell them if their enemy would fall, if their lover was faithful, if their fortune would turn. It was an inversion of everything society claimed was true. And yet, it happened over and over again. For centuries. Now let me share something that will give you chills. In 1586, a 14-year-old girl named Marie-Anne Lenormand ran away from a convent school in France. She had no money, no family waiting for her, nothing but a strange gift she had discovered within herself, the ability to read cards in a way that seemed to pull back the veil of time. She made her way to Paris, a city teeming with revolutionaries, dreamers, and desperate people seeking answers, and she became, without exaggeration, the most famous fortune teller in European history. Lenormand did not just read cards for commoners. Oh no, she advised Josephine de Beauharnais, the wife of Napoleon Bonaparte himself. Imagine that, the Empress of France, one of the most powerful women in the world, sitting in a dimly lit room, asking a card reader what fate had in store. Lenormand told her things, secret things, true things, things that came to pass. And when Lenormand died at the age of 71, she left behind an estate valued at 500,000 francs. In today's money, that is millions. A fortune built entirely on whispers of the future. But Lenormand was not the first, not even close. To understand how women came to hold this power, we need to go back much, much further, back before Christianity spread across Europe, back to the ancient world where female prophets were not hidden in cottages, they were enthroned in temples, they were called sibyls, and they were considered sacred. The most famous of these ancient seers was the Sibyl of Cumae, a priestess of Apollo in southern Italy. Her story is the stuff of legend. It is said that she lived for 1,000 years, her body withering away while her voice remained sharp and true. Roman kings sought her prophecies, generals consulted her before battles, and one day, according to the historian Dionysius of Halicarnassus, she approached Tarquinius Superbus, the last king of Rome, with 9 books of prophecy. Here is where it gets wild. She offered to sell him all 9 books for a certain price. He laughed at her. "Too expensive," he said. So what did she do? She burned 3 of the books right in front of him and offered him the remaining 6 for the same price. He refused again. So she burned 3 more. Now only 3 books remained, and she still demanded the original price. At this point, Tarquinius realized he was dealing with something beyond his understanding. He paid. He paid the full price for 3 books that had originally been 9, and those 3 books, the Sibylline books, were kept in the Temple of Jupiter in Rome and consulted only during the greatest emergencies. They were considered so sacred, so powerful that they shaped the decisions of emperors for centuries, until they were destroyed in a fire in 83 before the Common Era. Think about the audacity of that woman. The sheer confidence. She knew her worth. She knew that what she carried, knowledge, prophecy, vision, was priceless. And she made a king pay for it. That is power. Now you might be wondering, did these women really see the future? Or were they just incredibly skilled at reading people, at observing, making educated guesses? Honestly, it does not matter. What matters is that people believe they could. And belief, my friend, is everything. Belief makes a queen kneel before a card reader. Belief makes a farmer give his last coin to a woman who promises his daughter will recover from illness. Belief shapes empires. But here is the darker side of that belief. If you are a woman with power in a world that fears powerful women, you are never truly safe. The same gift that makes you revered can get you killed. The same community that seeks your help on Monday might accuse you of witchcraft on Friday. This tension, this razor's edge between veneration and violence, defined the lives of fortune-tellers for centuries, and it is a tension we will explore deeply as this story unfolds. Let me paint you a picture of what it was like to visit a cunning woman in medieval England. You would walk through the village, trying not to be seen, trying not to be recognized. You would find her cottage at the outskirts, away from the church, away from prying eyes. You would knock softly. She would open the door, and you would step into a world that smelled of herbs and smoke and something indefinable, something ancient. She might use a crystal ball, a sphere of glass or polished stone gazing into its depths until images formed. Or she might read your palm, tracing the lines of your hand as if there were a map of your destiny. Some used tea leaves, swirling the remains of your drink in a cup and interpreting the shapes left behind. Others employed astrology, calculating the positions of stars and planets at the moment of your birth. And some, the most mysterious of all, simply looked at you, looked into you, and told you things no one else could know. In 1617, a man named John Redman from Sutton discovered his wife had left him. He was desperate to find her, so he did what many people did in that era. He went from wizard to wizard, or as they term them, wise men, seeking someone who could bring her back. Notice that phrase, wizard to wizard. These practitioners were everywhere. It was an entire network, an entire industry. And the most sought after among them were women. Why women? There are theories, of course. Some historians argue that women, barred from formal education and official positions of power, turned to the occult as one of the few paths available to them. Others suggest that women were seen as naturally more intuitive, more connected to the mysterious rhythms of nature and the unseen world. And still others point out that in a patriarchal society, the act of a woman claiming secret knowledge was inherently subversive, inherently thrilling. It broke the rules, and people love rule breakers, even as they fear them. I want you to understand something crucial. These fortune tellers were not just con artists. Some of them, sure, but many were genuine healers, counselors, and community pillars. They helped women through difficult births. They provided herbal remedies when doctors were too expensive or too far away. They mediated disputes. They offered comfort in times of grief. Yes, they also claimed to see the future, but their role in society was so much larger, so much richer than that single skill. There is a beautiful complexity to their existence. They were feared and needed, scorned and sought, poor and powerful all at once. In Ireland, they called them Bean Feasa, which means wise woman. In Wales, Din Hispis, knowing man or woman. In Italy, Donne che aiutano, women who help. Every culture had a name for them. Every village had at least one. They were as much a part of medieval life as the church, the market, the harvest. And yet history has largely forgotten them. Or worse, remembered them only as villains, as witches, as frauds. But tonight, we are reclaiming their story. We are lighting a candle in the darkness and saying, these women mattered. These women shaped lives. These women held the keys to tomorrow, even when the world tried to lock them away. So as you lie there in the quiet of your room, I want you to imagine her, the fortune teller, the seer, the woman with dirt under her fingernails and stars in her eyes. Imagine the people who came to her door, hearts pounding, hoping for hope. Imagine the secrets she kept, the futures she foresaw, the lives she changed with nothing but words and belief. Because this is just the beginning. We have barely scratched the surface of this hidden world. In the next part of our journey, we are going to travel even further back in time to the ancient temples where the first Sibyls spoke prophecies that would echo through millennia. We are going to meet the priestesses who advised emperors, the oracles who shaped the course of history, and we are going to uncover the mysterious origins of the power that women like Lenormand and the Sibyl of Cumae wielded with such devastating effect. Trust me, you do not want to miss what comes next. The story is about to get even stranger, even more magical, so stay with me. Keep those lights low, keep your mind open, and let us step together through the veil of time into a world where women whispered the future and the world listened, trembling. See you in just a moment. We are stepping back now, way back, before the medieval cottages and whispered prophecies in the dark, before Christianity spread its cathedrals across Europe. We are going to a time when female prophets did not hide in shadows. They stood in marble temples. They wore crowns of laurel. They spoke, and emperors bowed. Let me take you to Delphi, Greece, around the 8th century before the Common Era. Picture a mountainside sanctuary so sacred that people travelled for months just to reach it. At the heart of this temple sat a woman on a 3-legged stool called a tripod, positioned directly over a crack in the earth. She breathed in vapours rising from below. Some say it was methane, others claim it was ethylene gas. and some insist it was pure divine inspiration. Whatever it was, it transformed her. Her eyes would roll back, her body would convulse, and from her lips would pour prophecies that determined the fate of nations. They called her the Pythia, but before her there was another. An even older prophetess known as the Delphic Sibyl, who some ancient writers claimed lived as far back as the 11th century before the Common Era. Pausanias, a Greek traveller writing in the 2nd century of the Common Era, described this original Sibyl as born between man and goddess, daughter of sea monsters and an immortal nymph. Whether you believe that or not, the point is clear. These women were seen as more than human. They were bridges between worlds. Now here is what blows my mind. The word Sibyl itself comes from the ancient Greek word Sibylla, meaning prophetess. But it was not just one woman. There were Sibyls scattered across the ancient Mediterranean world like stars in a constellation. Each one presided over a different sacred site. Each one served a different god, and each one wielded influence that would make modern politicians weep with envy. Let me introduce you to a few of them, because their stories are absolutely wild. First, there was the Erythraean Sibyl, named after the city of Erythrae in what is now Turkey. According to the ancient scholar Apollodorus, this Sibyl predicted the Trojan War before it even began. She prophesied that Troy would fall, that the Greeks would be victorious, and here is the kicker. She also predicted that Homer would write about it and that he would include falsehoods in his account. Imagine having the audacity to call out the greatest poet in history for future lies. That is next-level confidence. Then there was the Libyan Sibyl, consulted by none other than Alexander the Great after he conquered Egypt. Alexander, one of the most powerful military leaders who ever lived, travelled to the oracle of Amun in the Libyan desert specifically to hear what this prophetess had to say about his destiny. And what she told him shaped his belief that he was destined to rule the known world. One woman, one prophecy, an empire unleashed. But my personal favourite? The Tiburtine Sibyl, named after Tibur, which we now call Tivoli in Italy. She was so revered that medieval Christians rewrote her story entirely. They claimed she had prophesied the birth of Jesus Christ to the Roman Emperor Augustus himself. There is a legend that Augustus, standing at the height of his power, asked the Sibyl whether anyone greater than him would ever exist. She pointed to the sky where a vision appeared, a virgin holding a child, and supposedly Augustus built an altar right there called the Ara Primogeniti Dei, the altar of the firstborn of God. Now, did that actually happen? Probably not. But here is what matters. People believed it happened. For over 1,000 years, Christians across Europe believed that this pagan prophetess had seen Christ coming. They painted her in churches. They carved her image in stone. Michelangelo himself painted her on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, alongside the great prophets of the Old Testament, a pagan fortune-teller, honoured in the most sacred Christian space in the world. Let that sink in for a moment. This tells us something profound about the power these women held. Their prophecies were so influential, so deeply woven into the fabric of ancient life, that even when Christianity sought to replace pagan beliefs, they could not erase the Sibyls. Instead, they absorbed them. They Christianized them. They said, yes, these women saw the future, but they were unwitting instruments of our God. It is a fascinating contradiction, is it not? The Church condemned fortune-telling as heresy, as devil worship, as a sin punishable by death, and yet they celebrated the Sibyls. They made them holy, because deep down I think people understood something that goes beyond religion, beyond culture, beyond time. The future is terrifying, and anyone who claims to see it holds immense power. Now, let me tell you about the methods these ancient prophetesses used, because they were not just sitting around making vague predictions. They had techniques, rituals, processes. The Cumaean Sibyl, the one we talked about in the first part who sold those prophecy books to the Roman king, had a particularly dramatic method. According to the Roman poet Virgil, writing in the Aeneid around 30 to 19 before the Common Era, when someone came seeking prophecy, she would demand sacrifices first. 7 bulls and 7 ewes. Only after the blood had been spilled would she enter her prophetic state. Virgil describes it beautifully, and I am paraphrasing here. As she spoke, neither her face nor colour remained unchanged. Her hair fell wild and loose, her chest heaved, her heart swelled with passion. She seemed taller, no longer sounding mortal, for she had felt the god's breath upon her. Can you imagine witnessing that? Can you imagine being a soldier about to go to war, or a merchant about to risk everything on a voyage, standing in that cave, watching this woman transform before your eyes? The psychological impact alone would be staggering. You would believe. How could you not? And here is something I find particularly clever. The Cumaean Sibyl wrote her prophecies on oak leaves. She would arrange them at the entrance of her cave in a specific order. But if the wind came and scattered those leaves, she refused to put them back in order. She would just let them lie there, jumbled and meaningless. It was her way of saying, "The gods have spoken, but if you are careless, if you do not treat this knowledge with reverence, you will lose it forever." Talk about controlling your brand. Other sibyls used different methods. Some practiced what is called osteomancy, which involves throwing marked animal bones like dice and reading the patterns they formed. Archaeologists actually found a 3,000-year-old shrine in Gegherot, Armenia, filled with exactly these kinds of marked knuckle bones, along with incense burners, pottery idols, and wine vessels. They believe this site was specifically used for divination rituals. So we have physical proof that these practices were real, widespread, and sophisticated. Some sibyls used lithomancy, reading coloured pebbles. Others used alluromancy, which involves flour. Yes, flour. They would scatter flour in patterns or bake messages into bread and interpret how it broke apart. You know those fortune cookies you get at Chinese restaurants? That tradition has ancient roots. Humans have always wanted to crack something open and find their future inside. But beyond the techniques, beyond the rituals, I want you to think about what it meant to be a sibyl in the ancient world. You were not just a fortune teller. You were a political advisor, a therapist, a spiritual guide, a source of hope for the desperate and counsel for the powerful. You were consulted before wars, before marriages, before planting seasons, before everything important. The Roman Senate kept the Sibylline books under lock and key in the Temple of Jupiter on Capitoline Hill. They were only opened during times of extreme crisis, plagues, famines, invasions, civil wars. And when they were consulted, whatever those books said became law. Think about that. 3 scrolls written by a woman dictating the actions of the most powerful government on earth. Unfortunately, those original books were destroyed in a fire in 83 before the Common Era. The Romans were so devastated by this loss that they sent emissaries across the entire empire to collect similar prophecies, trying to recreate what had been lost. That is how valuable this knowledge was considered. Now, I want to address something you might be thinking. Were these women actually psychic? Did they really see the future? Here is my take. I think what they possessed was something both more and less mystical than magic. They possessed deep observation skills. They understood human nature. They knew politics, patterns, cycles of history. When a general came asking if he should invade, a good sibyl did not just throw bones and guess. She knew which kingdoms were weak, which alliances were shaky, which seasons favoured certain military campaigns. She synthesized information in an era before newspapers, before intelligence agencies, before any formal information networks. She was, in essence, an ancient data analyst with a flair for theatre. But here is the thing. That does not make them frauds. It makes them brilliant. They took their intelligence, their intuition, their understanding of the world, and they packaged it in a way that people could receive, because sometimes people do not want cold facts. They want ritual. They want mystery. They want to feel that the universe is speaking to them personally. And honestly, we are not so different today. We check our horoscopes, we read tarot cards, we take personality quizzes online that tell us which Harry Potter house we belong to, and we actually care about the answer. Why? Because we are seeking meaning. We are seeking patterns. We are seeking some sense that our lives are part of a larger story. The Sybils understood this. They gave people stories. They gave them meaning. They gave them the courage to make difficult decisions by framing those decisions as fated, as divinely ordained. There is one more Sibyl I need to tell you about before we move on. The Persian Sibyl, also known as the Babylonian or Hebrew Sibyl, depending on which ancient source you read. She was said to be named Sambetha, and some traditions claim she was related to Noah himself. Yes, that Noah, the Ark guy. Pausanias, that Greek traveller I mentioned earlier, wrote that she was called Sabe, daughter of Brosus and Erymantha. Some said she was Babylonian, others called her Egyptian. The point is, no one really knew for sure. She existed in this liminal space between cultures, between identities, and that ambiguity made her even more powerful. She belonged to everyone and no one. This Persian Sibyl was credited with predicting the conquests of Alexander the Great. She foresaw his rise, his glory, and according to some accounts, his early death. Nicanor, who wrote a biography of Alexander, specifically mentions consulting her prophecies. What fascinates me is how these Sibyls transcended cultural boundaries. Greeks honoured them. Romans worshipped them. Early Christians claimed them. Jews incorporated them into mystical traditions. They were a rare point of agreement in a deeply divided ancient world. Everyone believed in the Sibyls, and that brings me to the heart of what this part of our journey is really about. These ancient prophetesses were not just precursors to the medieval fortune tellers we will explore later. They set the template. They established that women could hold spiritual authority, that female voices could speak truth to power. That prophecy was not just masculine domain, not just the realm of priests and kings. When Christianity tried to erase pagan practices, they could not erase the Sibyls because the Sibyls had become too essential. So instead, the Church transformed them. In the medieval hymn Dies Irae, which means Day of Wrath, the Sibyl is mentioned alongside King David as a prophet of the Apocalypse. That hymn was sung in churches for centuries. Still is in some places. The Sibyls proved something crucial, that once women claim the power to interpret the divine, to speak the unspeakable, to know the unknowable, that power does not easily disappear. It shapeshifts, it adapts, it survives. So now, as we prepare to move forward in time, I want you to hold on to this image. A woman on a tripod, or breathing in sacred vapours, her voice carrying the weight of empires. Because that image, that archetype, never really went away. It transformed into the cunning woman in her cottage, the card reader in her parlour, the wise woman by the village well. Same power, different costume, same need, different century. Next, we are going to meet these women up close. We are going to walk into their homes, learn their names, discover their methods. We are going to see how the grand tradition of the Sibyls became something more intimate, more hidden, more dangerous. We are going to enter the world of the cunning folk, the healers and seers who carried this ancient flame through the darkest periods of European history. And trust me, their stories will make your heart race and your mind spin. Stay with me, we are just getting started. The temples have crumbled now. The grand sibyls with their marble halls and imperial audiences are gone, swept away by time and the rise of new religions. But the desperate human need to know what comes next, to heal what hurts, to find what is lost, that never disappeared. It simply went underground. It became quieter, more intimate, more dangerous. Welcome to the world of the cunning folk. Imagine England in the year 1604, a small village in Northumberland, barely a dot on any map. Winter has settled in hard, and in one of the cottages, a child lies burning with fever. The local physician, if there even is one, wants payment the family cannot afford. The priest offers prayers, but prayers alone have not brought down the fever. So in the dark of night, the mother wraps her cloak around her shoulders and walks to the edge of the village. To a cottage everyone knows but few openly discuss. She knocks, the door opens, and there stands Catherine Thompson, a cunning woman. Not a grand prophetess in flowing robes, just a middle-aged woman with work-worn hands and eyes that seem to see through things. Catherine does not ask for much explanation. She has seen this desperation before. She takes a live duck, holds its beak to the child's mouth, and begins reciting charms in a low, steady voice. Strange? Absolutely. Effective? The court records from that year tell us Catherine was convicted for exactly this practice, which means people kept coming to her despite the legal risk. They kept coming because sometimes, somehow, it worked. This is what the cunning folk were. They were the people you went to when everything else failed. When the doctor was too expensive. When the church offered only judgment. When your world was falling apart and you needed someone. Anyone who might be able to help. Now, the term cunning folk comes from Old English. And cunning here does not mean sneaky or deceitful. It means knowing, knowledgeable, wise. These were the wise women and wise men, the folk healers, the magical practitioners who filled the gaps in medieval and early modern life. And here is what surprises most people. They were everywhere, absolutely everywhere. In 19th century Norway, every single neighbourhood had at least one folk healer. Every single one. In England, during the 16th and 17th centuries, you could find cunning folk in virtually every parish. They were as common as blacksmiths, as essential as midwives. Some worked full-time at their craft, others had day jobs and practiced magic in the evenings to earn a little extra money. A shoemaker by day, an astrologer by night. A washerwoman who also happened to break curses on weekends. Let me introduce you to one of the most famous cunning men in English history, James Murrell of Hadley in Essex. He lived from approximately 1785 to 1860 and he was legendary. People travelled from all across southeast England to consult him. What did he do? Everything. He used astrology to locate stolen goods. He created charms to heal ailments that doctors could not touch. He broke curses. He identified witches who were supposedly causing harm to his clients. And he used a technique called scrying, which involves gazing into reflective surfaces like mirrors, crystal balls, or bowls of water to receive visions. Murrell was a shoemaker by trade, but his magical practice was what made him famous. When he died, people mourned him like he was royalty, because in many ways he was more important to their daily lives than any king or lord. He was the one who helped them when they were truly desperate. And here is something I love. These cunning folk did not use fancy ceremonial equipment. They did not have athames or magic swords or elaborate altars. They used whatever was at hand: keys, scissors, sieves, pitchforks, brooms, bottles, bits of paper. Things from the kitchen and the farm. Because magic, real practical magic, is not about expensive tools. It is about knowing how to use what you have. Although I have to admit, some of them were brilliant marketers. They understood the psychology of belief. One cunning woman in Yorkshire in the 1800s wore a tall conical hat and a robe covered in mystical symbols. She hung herbs and papers from her ceiling so that when you walked into her home, you immediately felt like you had entered another realm. Was it necessary for her magic to work? Probably not. But did it make people believe more strongly? Absolutely. And belief, as we have established, is half the battle. Now let me tell you about the range of services cunning folk provided, because it was vast. If you lost something valuable, you went to a cunning person. They would use astrology, scrying, or divination to tell you where it was or who took it. Court records are filled with cases like this. In 1617, a man named John Redman went from wizard to wizard, which is what they called them, trying to find his runaway wife. That is right. Missing persons cases. The cunning folk handled those too. If you suspected someone had cursed you, stolen your luck, or caused your animals to sicken through witchcraft, you went to a cunning person. They would perform counter-magic to break the curse. Sometimes this involved creating protective amulets, sometimes it meant rituals with fire and water, and sometimes it required identifying the witch responsible so you could confront them or bring them to court. If you were sick and the doctors had given up, you went to a cunning person. They might use herbal remedies passed down through generations, or they might perform elaborate rituals. I found one particularly wild example from 1846 reported in the Chelmsford Chronicle. A young man was suffering from a fever that no doctor could cure. His family consulted a cunning woman who gave them these instructions: cut a small nut in half, remove the kernel, place a live spider inside the shell, sew it up in a bag and wear it around the neck. As the spider wasted away inside the nut, the fever would leave the young man's body. Is that medicine? Not by modern standards. Is that magic? Is that psychology? Is that just desperate people trying anything? Maybe it is all of those things at once. The point is, it gave them hope. It gave them a sense of control in a world that felt utterly out of control. And then, of course, there were love spells. Oh, the love spells. Cunning folk made a tidy business helping people with romantic problems. Sometimes this meant using palmistry, scrying, or astrology to divine the name or appearance of a client's future lover. Other times it meant creating charms or potions to make someone fall in love with you. Were these ethical? Probably not always. Did people pay good money for them? You bet they did. Here is what I find remarkable. The cunning folk operated in this incredibly delicate space between official approval and outright persecution. The common people made a clear distinction between cunning folk and witches. Witches, in their minds, were harmful. They cursed, they destroyed, they worked with evil spirits. Cunning folk, on the other hand, were helpful. They healed, they protected, they worked with divine or at least neutral forces. But the authorities? They were not so sure. The church viewed all of this as superstition at best and heresy at worst. And yet there was no widespread persecution of cunning folk the way there was of accused witches. Why? Because too many people needed them. Even people in power sometimes consulted them quietly. And because the law struggled to figure out how to categorize what they did. Under the Witchcraft Act of 1541, passed by King Henry VIII, you could be executed for using magic to harm others, to cast love spells, or to find treasure. Notice what is missing: healing magic, protective magic. The law targeted harmful witchcraft but left a grey area around beneficial magic. This law was actually repealed by 1547, which historians believe happened because those in power realised the death penalty was too harsh, or that these were moral issues the church should handle, not the state. Let me tell you about some of the international variations of cunning folk, because this was not just an English phenomenon. In Ireland, they called them bean feasa if they were women, which means wise woman, or fear feasa for men, wise man. These Irish cunning folk were believed to cure illnesses caused by fairies or witches. They used short prayers or charms referencing Jesus, Mary, or the saints paired with repetitive motions and specific objects. They also performed funeral rites, preparing bodies for wakes and keening, which is a form of ritual wailing over the dead. One of the most famous Irish cunning women was Biddy Early, who lived from 1798 to 1872. She was so renowned that people came from all over Ireland to see her. She used a dark blue bottle to scry and see the future, and she never charged the poor for her services. When she died, that bottle was thrown into a lake, and people say it was never recovered. There are still stories told about Biddy Early in Ireland today. She has become almost mythological. In Sweden they call them Kloka Gumma, which means wise old women. And here is an interesting twist. There is an old idea that these wise women were the main victims of the witch trials in 17th century Sweden, but historians now believe that is not quite accurate. Some wise women and wise men were indeed punished, but usually not for witchcraft. They were charged with superstition instead. Take Britta Björn of Gotland, for example. In court she claimed she learned to heal the sick during time she spent in the underworld. Yes, the underworld. She was sentenced to prison terms in both 1722 and 1737. But here is the fascinating part. The punishments did not stop people from seeking her help. In fact, they had the opposite effect. It was like free advertising. The vicar complained that people from throughout the country came to seek her help and relied on her as if she were God. After her first sentence, her client base only grew, and both her daughter and her granddaughter became healing women too. It was a family business. In Norway, some cunning women achieved genuine national fame, which was incredibly unusual for women of that era. Morsetha, who lived from 1793 to 1851, Anna Branfjell from 1810 to 1905, and Valborg Valand, 1821 to 1903, were all household names in Norway. People knew their stories. People travelled days to see them. They were celebrities in their own right. And in Italy, the names for cunning folk varied by region. They were called praticos, wise people, or guaritori, healers, or fattucchier, fixers, or my personal favourite, donne che aiutano, women who help, just women who help. There is something so beautiful and simple about that. What united all these practitioners across different countries and cultures was their role in the community. They were problem solvers. They were the people you went to when the official systems failed you, and they were disproportionately women. Why? We touched on this before, but it bears repeating. For women in medieval and early modern Europe, paths to independence and income were severely limited. You could marry, you could join a convent, you could do certain kinds of manual labour, or, if you had the knowledge and the nerve, you could become a cunning woman. It was one of the very few ways a woman could live on her own terms, support herself, and wield genuine power in her community. Yes, it was risky. Yes, it could get you in trouble, but for some women, that risk was worth the freedom. And here is something that does not get talked about enough. Many of these cunning folk genuinely helped people. Were some of them charlatans? Sure. Were some of them deluded? Possibly. But many were skilled herbalists who understood plants and their properties in ways that would later influence formal medicine. There is a documented case from 1785 where an English physician named William Withering gave credit to a local wise woman for teaching him to use foxglove, also known as digitalis, to treat heart conditions. That treatment proved effective and is still used in modified forms today. These women were keepers of knowledge. They knew which herbs reduced fever, which ones eased pain, which ones could stop bleeding, or induce labour or calm anxiety. They passed this information down through generations, mother to daughter, mentor to apprentice. And sometimes that knowledge made its way into official medical practice, though often without credit given to the wise women who discovered it first. So when we talk about cunning folk, we are not just talking about fortune tellers and spellcasters. We are talking about community healers, counselors, midwives, herbalists, and yes, sometimes entertainers who gave people a sense of wonder in difficult lives. They were complex. They were essential. And they were overwhelmingly women taking power in one of the few spaces available to them, but that power came with a price. And as Christianity tightened its grip on Europe, as the authorities became more suspicious of anything that smelled of magic, that price got higher and higher. The line between cunning woman and witch became thinner, more dangerous, more deadly. In our next part, we are going to dive deep into the actual tools and techniques these women used. The crystal balls, the tea leaves, the mysterious rituals that seemed like nonsense but somehow worked. We are going to explore the methods behind the magic and discover what modern psychology and neuroscience can tell us about why these practices were so effective. Because here is the secret. Whether or not magic is real, the psychology behind it absolutely is. And understanding that psychology will change how you see everything. So stay close, keep breathing. Let your mind wander through these stories, because we're about to unlock some secrets that have been hidden for centuries. Picture yourself standing in a dimly lit room somewhere in medieval England. On a wooden table before you sits a sphere of polished crystal, no larger than an orange, catching the candlelight and throwing strange reflections across the walls. The woman across from you, the cunning woman you have paid your last coins to see, leans forward and whispers, "Look into it. Tell me what you see. What would you see truly? Would you see images forming in the depths of that glass? Visions of your future? Or would you see only reflections, shadows, the desperate projections of your own anxious mind?" Here is the beautiful secret. It does not matter. Because the tools these women used were never really about the objects themselves. They were about creating a space where the impossible felt possible, where the hidden could be revealed, where tomorrow could whisper its secrets to today. Let us talk about the actual instruments of divination, the physical tools that fortune tellers have used for thousands of years. Because each one tells a story not just about magic, but about human psychology, about what we need to believe, about how our minds work when we're desperate for answers. The crystal ball is probably the most iconic fortune-telling tool in existence. Close your eyes and imagine a fortune teller, and I bet you picture a woman gazing into a crystal sphere, right? That image is so embedded in our culture that it feels ancient, timeless, universal, and in a way, it is. Pliny the Elder, a Roman author and naturalist, described the use of crystal balls by soothsayers as early as the 1st century of the Common Era. He called it crystallum orbis, which later scribes wrote in medieval Latin as orbiculum. But here is what most people do not know. Genuine crystal balls were incredibly expensive. Rock crystal, which is pure quartz, had to be mined, shaped and polished by hand. A sphere of any significant size represented months of labour. So who could afford them? Only the wealthiest cunning folk, and even then many used substitutes. Polished glass, obsidian mirrors, even bowls of water with a dark backing. Because it was not really about the crystal itself. It was about the practice of scrying, which means gazing into a reflective or translucent surface to receive visions. And you can scry with almost anything. A mirror, a puddle, a piece of polished metal. The surface is just a focus point, a place for your eyes to rest while your mind opens to possibility. Court records from 1633 in Scotland mention a woman named Isabel Sinclair, who claimed she'd been granted second sight by fairies. She used scrying to help people identify thieves and locate stolen property. Her clients would peer into whatever reflective surface she provided, mirrors or bowls of water, and somehow they would see the faces of the people who had wronged them. Now, was this magic? Or was it that when you stare into a reflective surface long enough, especially in dim, flickering candlelight, your brain starts creating images from the random patterns of light and shadow? And if you already suspect someone of stealing from you, might your subconscious helpfully provide their face in that swirling darkness? Modern neuroscience has a term for this: pareidolia. It is the tendency of the human brain to perceive meaningful patterns in random stimuli. It is why we see faces in clouds, why we see animals in ink blots, why we see the man in the moon. Our brains are pattern recognition machines, and they will find patterns even where none exist, especially when we desperately want them to. The cunning folk knew this. Maybe not in scientific terms, but they knew that if you put someone in the right state of mind, gave them the right tools, and asked the right questions, their own mind would do most of the work. Let us talk about tea leaves. Tasseomancy, the practice of reading tea leaves or coffee grounds, became hugely popular in the 18th and 19th centuries. The method is simple. You drink tea or coffee from a cup, leaving a small amount of liquid and the grounds or leaves at the bottom. You swirl the cup 3 times, turn it upside down on a saucer, and let the remaining liquid drain. Then you look at the patterns formed by the leaves or grounds stuck to the inside of the cup. A manual from 1920 called Teacup Reading and the Art of Fortune Telling by Tea Leaves, written by someone calling themselves a Highland seer, provides interpretations. The shape of a dove meant prosperity and luck. A chair meant an imminent pregnancy. 3 women at the bottom of your cup meant you were about to become mixed up in a terrible scandal. Now think about how brilliant this is as a fortune-telling method. First, it is accessible. Anyone can do it. You do not need expensive equipment, just tea and a cup. Second, it is participatory. The person seeking the fortune is actively involved in creating the pattern by drinking and swirling. This creates psychological investment. And third, the patterns are abstract enough that they can be interpreted in dozens of ways, which means the reader can tailor the fortune to what the client seems to need. If the client seems anxious about money, that dove-shaped blob becomes a sign of coming prosperity. If they seem lonely, suddenly that smudge looks like a ring indicating marriage. The tea leaves are a mirror, reflecting back what the client brings to the reading. Coffee ground reading, which became especially popular in Turkish culture during the 19th century, actually changed drinking habits. Coffee became the most popular drink among Turkish working-class women, specifically because they would then read each other's grounds. It was a social ritual, a form of entertainment, and a way for women to connect with and support each other. They were not just predicting the future, they were creating community. Now let me tell you about tarot cards because their history is wild and not at all what most people think. Playing cards first arrived in Europe in the 15th century. For the first few hundred years, they were mostly just used for games, entertainment for the courts and wealthy families. It was not until the late 18th to early 19th century that fortune tellers began using tarot cards for divination. The images on tarot cards, with their blend of ancient mythologies and archetypal figures, create a rich symbolic language. The Fool, the High Priestess, the Tower, the Wheel of Fortune. Each card carries layers of meaning, and when laid out in patterns called spreads, they create a narrative. A story about where you have been, where you are, and where you might be going. But here is the key. Tarot does not predict a fixed future. Good readers will tell you this outright. Instead, it helps you explore possibilities, examine your situation from different angles, and clarify your own thoughts and feelings. It is less like fortune-telling and more like therapy with pictures, and honestly, That makes it more valuable, not less. Because what most people really need is not to know the future. They need help making sense of the present. They need someone to listen, to ask questions, to help them see their situation with fresh eyes. Palmistry, the reading of lines and shapes on the hand, has similarly ancient roots. The nomadic Roma people are often credited with spreading palmistry throughout Europe during the Middle Ages. They would read the lines on your palm, the mounts of flesh at the base of each finger, the overall shape of your hand, and from these physical features, they would tell you about your character and destiny. Here is something that will make you smile. During the witch hunts, some accusers used birthmarks and unusual lines on a person's palm as evidence of a satanic pact. Yes, really, your own hand could betray you as a witch. Imagine being arrested because you had a weird freckle on your palm. But palmistry survived despite this persecution. Why? Because humans are fascinated by the idea that our bodies carry hidden information about who we are and who we might become. And to be fair, modern science does recognize that certain physical traits correlate with certain conditions. Your hand shape can indicate hormonal influences during development. Fingerprints are unique identifiers, so the idea that your body tells a story. That part is actually true. Let me share with you some of the stranger divination methods that have existed throughout history, because people have tried to predict the future using almost everything imaginable. Osteomancy, throwing bones and reading the patterns they form when they land. Remember that 3,000-year-old shrine in Armenia we talked about? They found marked animal knuckle bones there, used exactly like dice. This practice existed across cultures. Some used sheep knuckle bones, some used chicken bones. The bones would be marked with symbols, thrown onto a cloth or into a circle, and their positions would be interpreted. Alluromancy, divination using flour. This one always makes me chuckle because it feels so mundane. You would scatter flour in patterns or bake messages into bread and interpret how it broke apart. And yes, this is an ancient ancestor of the fortune cookie. Humans have always wanted to crack something open and find their destiny inside. Molybdomancy, divination by molten metal. You would heat lead or tin until it liquefied, then pour it into cold water. The metal would solidify into random shapes, and these shapes would be interpreted as omens. This practice was common in Europe well into the 20th century, especially around New Year's Eve. People still do variations of it today in some countries. Nephomancy, reading the shapes of clouds. This is probably the oldest form of divination because it requires no tools at all, just a sky and an imagination. You look up, watch the clouds drift and change, and interpret their shapes as messages. A cloud that looks like a ship means a journey. A cloud shaped like a face means a stranger will enter your life. Again, we are back to pareidolia, our brain's desperate need to find meaning in chaos. And then there are methods that sound frankly absurd but were taken very seriously. Philidomancy, divination by observing the behavior of cats. Yes, cats. If a cat crossed your path from left to right, that meant one thing, right to left, something else. If a cat washed its face, rain was coming. If it turned its back to the fire, expect a storm. Was this real prediction? Or was it just people watching animals closely and noticing actual patterns in their behavior that correlated with weather changes? Animals can detect shifts in barometric pressure, changes in humidity, things humans cannot sense as easily. So maybe the cunning folk who watched cats were actually onto something, just interpreting it through a magical framework. Here is what fascinates me about all these methods. They're all doing the same thing. They are creating a ritualized space for observation and interpretation. They slow you down. They make you pay attention. They force you to focus on something outside your usual worries, and in that space, your mind often finds clarity. Think about it. If you are anxious and spiraling, obsessing over a problem, sometimes what you need is not an answer but a circuit breaker, something to interrupt the anxious loop. So you sit down with someone who says, "Let us see what the tea leaves say." And for those few minutes you are not worrying. You're watching, wondering, imagining, and often in that space your own wisdom rises to the surface. A good fortune teller does not tell you your future. She helps you access your own intuition, your own deep knowledge about your situation that you have been too scared or too distracted to acknowledge. She gives you permission to hope, to fear, to plan, to change course. The cards or leaves or crystal ball are just the excuse, the ritual framework that makes it feel safe to explore possibilities you've been avoiding. And sometimes, honestly, what people needed was just someone who would listen. In medieval villages, in tight-knit communities where everyone knew everyone's business, where could you go to speak freely about your fears, your desires, your secrets? The priest would judge you, your neighbours would gossip, but the cunning woman? She had heard everything, nothing shocked her. And crucially, she had a professional obligation to keep your secrets because her business depended on discretion. So in a way, these women were the first therapists, the first counsellors, the first people who created a safe, confidential space for people to explore their inner lives. Now, does that mean there was no genuine psychic ability involved? I am not here to tell you that. I have heard too many stories, met too many people who have experienced genuinely inexplicable things to dismiss the possibility entirely. Maybe some of these women really did have gifts that science cannot yet explain. Maybe consciousness is stranger than we understand. Maybe time is not as linear as we think. Or maybe not. Maybe it was all psychology, intuition, observation, and the profound human need for meaning, meeting the human capacity for pattern recognition. Either way, it worked. It helped people, it gave comfort, it provided guidance. And in a harsh, uncertain world, that had genuine value. What I can tell you is this: whether we call it magic or psychology, whether we believe in the supernatural or not, these tools have survived for thousands of years because they meet a real human need. The need to feel that the universe has order, the need to believe that our choices matter, the need to hope that tomorrow might be better than today, and the need, above all, to feel that we are not alone in our uncertainty. Every time you check your horoscope and every time you pull a tarot card, every time you make a wish on a star or knock on wood or avoid walking under a ladder, you are participating in this ancient tradition. You are doing what humans have always done, reaching for meaning, reaching for control, reaching for hope in a world that often feels chaotic and cruel. And there is no shame in that. There is beauty in it. In our next section, we are going to meet a specific group of women who became synonymous with fortune-telling across all of Europe, the Roma people, often pejoratively called gypsies. These women faced incredible persecution, lived as outcasts in nearly every society, and yet somehow became the most sought-after seers and palm readers on the continent. Their story is heartbreaking and inspiring in equal measure, and it reveals something profound about power, survival, and the strange alchemy that happens when society rejects you but cannot stop needing you. So take a breath. Let these tools and techniques settle in your mind, and prepare yourself, because the next part of our journey gets more personal, more painful, and ultimately more powerful than anything we have explored so far. There is an image burned into European consciousness, repeated in paintings, books, films, and folklore for centuries. A dark-haired woman in colourful scarves, gold jewellery glinting in candlelight, reaching across a table to take your hand. Her fingers trace the lines of your palm while her eyes seem to look through you, beyond you, into realms you cannot see. She is Roma. She is a Drabadi, a fortune-teller. and she is probably the most recognizable symbol of fortune-telling in Western culture. But here is the question that haunts me. How did a people so thoroughly rejected by society, so consistently persecuted, expelled and despised, become the very face of mystical knowledge? How did outcasts become oracles? And what does that contradiction tell us about power, survival, and the human need for magic? The story of the Roma people and their connection to fortune-telling is complex, painful, and shot through with a kind of defiant brilliance. So let us unravel it together, carefully, with the respect it deserves. First, we need to understand who the Roma people actually are, because the myths have obscured the truth for centuries. For a long time, Europeans believed they came from Egypt, which is why they were called gypsies, a corruption of Egyptian. Others thought they originated in India, Turkey, or various parts of the Middle East. But modern linguistic and genetic research has given us a clearer picture. Scholars who studied the Romani language and dialect determined that the Roma people most likely originated in northern India, probably in the Punjab region, and began migrating westward around the year 855. They travelled through Persia, Armenia, and eventually into Europe. By 1505 they had reached the British Isles, where people called them Anglo-Romani. They were a nomadic people which already made settled Europeans suspicious. Nomads did not fit into the feudal system. They did not swear allegiance to local lords. They moved according to their own rhythms, their own needs. And that freedom in a society built on rigid hierarchies and fixed locations was threatening. But beyond their nomadic lifestyle, there was something else that marked them as different. They brought with them knowledge and skills that seemed exotic, powerful, and slightly dangerous. They were metalworkers, tinsmiths, horse traders, musicians, entertainers, and yes, they practiced divination, particularly palmistry. The Roma are often credited with spreading the art of palm reading throughout medieval Europe. When they arrived in new regions, women among them would offer to read palms, tell fortunes, and provide insights about the future. These women were called drabadi. And here is the fascinating paradox. They had one strict rule. They would read the palms and fortunes of anyone at all, except other Roma. Think about that for a moment. They would not practice divination within their own community. Why? Some scholars believe it was because fortune-telling was a service they provided to outsiders, a way to earn money and navigate hostile societies. It was work, not spiritual practice for themselves. Others suggest it was a protective measure, maintaining a boundary between their authentic cultural practices and what they performed for paying customers. Whatever the reason, this choice created a specific dynamic. The drabadi became figures who existed at the threshold. They were part of Roma society but performed for the outside world. They were needed but not trusted, sought but not welcomed. They occupied a liminal space, which is exactly where magic has always lived. The image of the Roma fortune teller became so widespread, so iconic, that it made its way into popular culture everywhere. In 1899, the game company Parker Brothers created a board game literally called the Roma Fortune Teller Game. Films, novels, operas all featured the mysterious gypsy woman who could see your fate in the lines of your hand. But behind that romantic image was a much harsher reality. The Roma faced brutal persecution almost everywhere they went. They were expelled from countries. They were enslaved in some regions. They were forbidden to practice their trades. Laws were passed specifically targeting them. And when they turned to fortune-telling as a means of survival, they were accused of fraud, trickery, witchcraft. In 1385, the Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund provided them with safe conduct, essentially a document guaranteeing their right to travel unmolested. But that protection did not last. Over the following centuries, many countries expelled them, deported them, or worse. Simply being Roma could be a crime punishable by death in some places and times. And yet people kept seeking them out. Nobility kept consulting them. Even those who publicly despised them would privately slip into their camps, cross their palms with silver, and ask about love, about fortune, about fate. There is a famous painting by the Italian artist Caravaggio from 1595 called The Fortune Teller. It shows exactly this dynamic. A well-dressed young man stands while a Roma woman in a headscarf reads his palm. But if you look closely, really closely, you will see what is actually happening. While she tells his fortune with one hand, her other hand is slipping the ring off his finger. She is stealing from him even as she supposedly serves him. Now, was Caravaggio saying all Roma fortune tellers were thieves? Probably. That was the prejudice of the time. But I see something else in that painting too. I see a commentary on the transaction itself. The young man wants something from her, knowledge he should not possess, power she supposedly wields, and she takes something from him in return. Is that theft? Or is that simply the price of doing business at the margins of society? Because here is the truth. When you're expelled from legitimate economic systems, when every door is closed to you, when your very existence is criminalized, you survive however you can. If people will pay you to read their palms, you read palms. If they will pay you to tell fortunes, you tell fortunes. It does not matter if they despise you the rest of the time. Money spends the same, and some of these women became genuinely skilled at what they did. Not because they had supernatural powers necessarily, but because they developed profound observational abilities. When you live on the margins, when your survival depends on reading people accurately, you learn to notice things. The calluses on someone's hands tell you what kind of work they do. The quality of their clothes tells you their social class. The way they hold themselves tells you if they are confident or afraid. The questions they ask tell you what they are worried about. A skilled drabadi could look at you and within seconds know if you were a merchant worried about money, a young woman anxious about marriage, a soldier fearing death, a mother grieving a child. And once she knew that, she could tell you what you needed to hear, not to deceive you necessarily, but to give you comfort, hope, or the courage to make a decision you'd been avoiding. Let me share a specific example that breaks my heart. In Long Island, New York in 1932, a photograph was taken of a Roma fortune teller at a fair. She sits in traditional dress, surrounded by the symbols of her trade. People line up to have their fortunes told, and she is doing what her people have done for centuries, surviving by giving people what they want, by performing mystery and magic in a world that otherwise refuses to see her humanity. Fast forward to 2003, when San Francisco began regulating fortune-telling. The city government actually worked with members of the local Roma community to craft legislation. They wanted to create a system that would satisfy everyone. The law they created still assumes the threat of fraud, requiring background checks, fingerprinting, photographs, and public hearings before issuing a permit. But at least it recognizes fortune-telling as a legitimate industry. However, and this is crucial, the law's requirements threaten the livelihood of some Roma practitioners who, for various reasons, often lack the government documentation needed to comply. Centuries of persecution, of being expelled and displaced, mean that many Roma do not have birth certificates, official records, the paper trail that settled society's demand. So even well-intentioned laws can exclude the very people they claim to help. And that brings us to something important we need to talk about. The connection between the Roma people and fortune-telling is fraught, complicated. On one hand, it is part of their cultural heritage, a real skill many practiced. On the other hand, it has been used to stereotype them, to reduce an entire ethnic group to a caricature. The word gypsy itself, which many Roma find offensive because it is based on the false belief they came from Egypt, has become inseparable from images of crystal balls and fortune-telling. Even today, when someone wants to dress up as a fortune-teller for Halloween, they wear what they think of as gypsy clothes. They do not consider that they are taking a people's actual cultural dress, their actual survival strategy under persecution, and turning it into a costume. That is painful. That is erasure disguised as appreciation. So we need to hold two truths at once. Yes, many Roma women practiced fortune-telling, and some were brilliant at it. Yes, they contributed significantly to the techniques and imagery of divination in Europe. And yes, they deserve credit and recognition for that. But also, yes, they have been stereotyped, persecuted, and reduced to this single identity when their culture is so much richer and more complex than palm reading alone. Here is what I find remarkable about the Drabadi. They took the very thing society used to exclude them, their otherness, their mysteriousness, their outsider status, and they turned it into a source of income and influence. Europeans did not want Roma as neighbours, but they wanted them as fortune-tellers. They did not want them settling in their towns, but they wanted access to their supposed magical knowledge. And the Roma women said, "Fine, you want mystery? We will give you mystery. You want magic? We will sell you magic, but we will do it on our terms, and we will keep our actual sacred practices to ourselves." It is a kind of resistance, is it not? A kind of subversive power. You cannot join our society. We will create our own economy. You fear our difference? We will make you pay for the privilege of briefly touching it. Let me tell you about one more painting, because art tells us so much about how these women were perceived. In 1922, the Spanish artist Julio Romero de Torres painted a scene of a young girl having her fortune told. She is in love with a married man, who you can see in the background abandoning his wife. The Roma fortune teller holds up a card warning of dangers ahead. The painting captures that moment of decision, when knowledge of the future might change your path, when prophecy becomes both gift and burden. And that girl's face, you can see everything there. Hope, fear, desperate desire to know. And the fortune teller's face shows something else. Knowledge, sadness, an understanding that seeing the future does not always help. Because that is the secret no one talks about, is it not? Sometimes knowing what is coming makes things harder, not easier. Sometimes ignorance is a blessing. But humans cannot help themselves. We always want to know. We always peek behind the curtain. We always bite the apple. The Drabadi understood this about human nature. They understood that people would pay not for happy lies, but for any scrap of certainty in an uncertain world. Even bad news delivered with authority is somehow better than the agony of not knowing. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, the association between Roma people and fortune-telling only grew stronger. In areas where other forms of employment were completely closed to them, fortune-telling became one of the few ways Roma women could earn money. It was a trap in a way. Society pushed them into this role, then punished them for it, accused them of fraud, arrested them, fined them. Between 1900 and 1918 in Australia alone, there were 247 prosecutions for fortune-telling, and the vast majority were women, many of them Roma. But here is the thing, the prosecutions did not stop the practice. They could not, because the demand was too high. People needed what these women offered. And what did they offer, really? Yes, predictions about the future, but more than that, they offered attention. They offered a space where you could speak your fears and dreams out loud. They offered a moment of feeling special, of feeling seen, of feeling that the universe had a plan for you specifically. In a world that treated most people as interchangeable, as mere cogs in social and economic machines, the fortune teller said, "You're unique. Your fate matters. Your life has meaning, and people paid for that. People needed that. According to the latest research from Pew, even today, women are twice as likely as men to consult fortune tellers. Why do you think that is? I suspect it is because women, historically denied access to other forms of power and knowledge, turned to spaces where they could ask questions and receive answers that the official male-dominated structures would not provide. The doctor would not take their pain seriously. The priest would tell them to be obedient. But the fortune teller, she would listen. She would tell them their instincts were right. She would validate their inner knowing. So when we talk about the Roma Drabadi, we are talking about women who survived impossible circumstances through intelligence, adaptability, and an uncanny ability to give people what they needed. We are talking about women who turned persecution into profit, otherness into mystique, exclusion into a strange kind of power. And we are talking about women who paid a heavy price for that survival. They were never safe, never fully respected, never allowed to just exist without suspicion, without accusation, without threat. But they persisted. They passed their knowledge down through generations, and they shaped the entire Western image of what a fortune teller looks like, sounds like, acts like. Even today, when you think of someone who can see the future, I bet you picture a woman who looks like them. That is cultural power. That is legacy, even if it came at a terrible cost. As we move forward in this story, we are going to shift our focus to the economics of fortune telling. We are going to talk about women who became wealthy beyond imagining by selling glimpses of tomorrow. We are going to explore how fortune telling was not just survival, but sometimes serious business. Big business. The kind of business that could lift a woman from poverty to luxury, from powerlessness to influence. So stay with me. Let the image of the Drabadi settle in your mind, that woman at the threshold, that keeper of secrets, that seller of hope. Because her story is about to get even more interesting. Money changes everything. It changes how people see you, how they treat you, what doors open or close. And for women in history, access to money meant access to something even rarer. Freedom. The freedom to live alone, to make choices, to say no, to exist on your own terms in a world designed to make you dependent. So let us talk about the fortune tellers who did not just survive. Let us talk about the ones who became wealthy, powerful, influential beyond anything society said women were allowed to be. Because their stories reveal something fascinating about the economics of belief, about what people will pay for when they are desperate, and about how some women turned whispers of the future into solid gold. I want to start with a number that will make your jaw drop. 500,000 francs. That is what Marie-Anne Lenormand left behind when she died in 1843 at the age of 71. In today's money, adjusted for inflation and relative wealth, we are talking about several $1 million. And how did she make that fortune? By reading cards. By telling people what tomorrow might bring, by being so extraordinarily good at her craft that everyone from street vendors to empresses came knocking at her door. We mentioned Lenormand briefly before, but now we need to really understand what she achieved, because it is staggering. Remember, she ran away from a convent school at 14 years old with nothing. No family money, no connections, no safety net. Just this strange gift she had discovered. The ability to read playing cards in ways that seemed to unlock secrets. She arrived in Paris around 1786, right before the French Revolution would tear the country apart, and she set up shop as a cartomancer, a fortune teller who uses cards. At first, her clients were ordinary people, merchants, shopkeepers, people with a few coins to spare and worries that kept them awake at night. But word spread, the way it always does when someone is genuinely skilled, or genuinely convincing, or maybe both. Here is what made Lenormand different. She was specific. She did not give vague universal predictions that could apply to anyone. She told people detailed, concrete things. She predicted that a certain general would be victorious in battle, that a particular merchant would lose his ship, that a woman's husband was being unfaithful with a blonde woman who lived on the east side of the city, and often, disturbingly often, she was right. Was she psychic? Was she exceptionally intelligent and observant? Was she running an information network, paying servants and gossips to feed her inside knowledge? Historians debate this, but here is what we know for certain. She became so famous that Joséphine de Beauharnais, who would become Napoleon Bonaparte's wife and Empress of France, consulted her regularly. Imagine that. The most powerful woman in France sitting in Lenormand's parlour, asking a card reader about her future. What Lenormand told her, we can only partially reconstruct from historical records. But we know Joséphine believed her, trusted her, kept coming back. And it was not just Joséphine. Lenormand advised Robespierre and Marat during the Revolution. She consulted for military leaders, politicians, aristocrats. These were not gullible peasants. These were educated, powerful people making life and death decisions, and they turned to a woman with a deck of cards. In 1819, when Lenormand was 44 years old, she met Frances, Lady Shelley, a British aristocrat and friend of the Duke of Wellington. Lady Shelley later wrote about the encounter in her diary. She described being taken into Lenormand's luxurious boudoir, which tells us something right there. Luxurious. This was not a modest cottage, this was high-end accommodation. Then Lady Shelley was led into Lenormand's cabinet of study, a dedicated workspace for her divination practice. Lenormand asked for her birth date, the first letter of her name, the first letter of her birthplace, and then her favourite animal, colour, and number. She was building a profile, gathering information, and then she laid out the cards and told Lady Shelley things about her life that apparently left the aristocrat shaken. What is crucial here is that Lady Shelley was not some impressionable young girl. She was a sophisticated, well-travelled woman of high society, and she took Lenormand seriously enough to write about her, to remember the encounter decades later. So how much did Lenormand charge? We do not have exact records, but we know she was not cheap. She could not have accumulated 500,000 francs by charging pennies. She was probably charging what the market would bear, adjusting her prices based on the client's obvious wealth. A nobleman paid more than a shopkeeper, an empress paid more than a nobleman. It is simple economics, and here is the brilliant part. Lenormand understood branding. She published books about her methods. She created her own modified deck of cards, which fortune tellers still use today and which bear her name, Lenormand cards. She was not just practicing fortune-telling, she was building an empire around it. She was creating a product, a methodology, a legacy. When she died, her nephew, a devout Catholic, inherited everything. And what did he do? According to historian Michael Dummett, a former professor of logic at Oxford who studied this extensively, the nephew was horrified by his aunt's profession. He took her fortune and burned all her cards, crystals, and fortune-telling equipment. He wanted to erase her legacy, to pretend it never happened, but it was too late. Lenormand had already changed the game. She had proven that a woman with no family wealth, no formal education, nothing but talent and determination, could become genuinely rich and influential through fortune-telling. She had shown it was possible. And she was not alone. Let me tell you about a case from New York that perfectly illustrates how lucrative this business could be. An article in the New York Tribune from 1881 describes a widow whose income jumped from $6 per week as a washerwoman to $60 per week as a clairvoyant. Read that again. $6 to $60. A tenfold increase. For context, $6 a week was barely survival wages. You could pay rent and buy food, but there was nothing left over. No savings, no security, One emergency and you were destitute. But $60 a week? That was middle-class income. That was respectability. That was the difference between constant anxiety and actual stability. And here is what I love about this story. She was a washerwoman. One of the lowest paid, most back-breaking jobs a woman could do. Scrubbing other people's clothes until your hands bled. And she found a way out. She discovered she had a gift, or learned the skills, or simply had the courage to claim she could see the future. And people paid her well. Now, not everyone supported this economic shift. An article in the New York Daily Herald from 1847 complained bitterly about a class of vagrants known as fortune-tellers, who are now calling themselves professors of palmistry or ladies of science. The author is clearly outraged that these women, many of whom came from nothing, were living in splendid apartments, keeping regular business hours and making comfortable, sometimes luxurious livings. There is such disdain in that article, such offence at the idea that these women, these fortune-tellers, were thriving. Because they were not supposed to thrive, they were supposed to stay poor, stay powerless, stay in their place. But they refused. They built businesses, they made money, they lived well, and the establishment hated it. Authorities tried repeatedly to regulate, tax, or criminalize fortune-telling, not because it harmed anyone, but because it represented women making independent incomes outside traditional male-controlled structures. It was about control. It was always about control. Think about what fortune-telling offered women economically. You did not need capital to start. You did not need a shop or equipment or inventory. You just needed knowledge, or the appearance of knowledge, and a place to meet clients. You could work from home, set your own hours, choose your own clients, keep all the profits. For women who were barred from most professions, who could not own property in many places, who lost all legal rights when they married, fortune-telling was a rare path to genuine economic independence. No wonder thousands of women pursued it. No wonder they risked arrest, social stigma, and worse. Let me give you a sense of scale. In Italy today, fortune-telling is an €8 billion industry. 8 billion. That is not a typo. In the past 10 years, demand for fortune-tellers' services in Italy alone has grown 5 times over. People are spending billions of euros to have their futures read. And the majority of those fortune-tellers? Still women. This is not ancient history. This is happening right now. In 2025, in our supposedly rational scientific age, people are paying enormous amounts of money to consult with those who claim to see what is coming. Why? Same reasons as always. Uncertainty, fear, hope, the desperate need to feel that someone somewhere knows what is going to happen. But let us go back to history, because I want you to understand how the economics worked on a practical level. In 19th century London and New York, fortune-tellers advertised openly in newspapers. You could flip through the classifieds and see dozens of ads, Madame So-and-so, clairvoyant and spiritual advisor, Professor such-and-such, master of palmistry and astrology. They listed their addresses, their hours, their specialties. Some operated out of storefronts. Others received clients in their homes. The wealthiest ones maintained dedicated salons, beautifully decorated spaces designed to create atmosphere. Velvet curtains, low lighting, incense, mysterious symbols on the walls, all of it calculated to make clients feel they were entering a different realm where normal rules did not apply. And the fortune-tellers who succeeded understood something crucial. They were not just selling predictions, they were selling an experience, theatre, mystery, a story in which the client was the protagonist and fate itself was paying attention to them specifically. The pricing strategies were sophisticated. Many fortune-tellers offered tiered services. A basic palm reading might cost 50 cents, but a full astrological chart with predictions for the year, That could run $5 or $10, which in the 1800s was serious money. Consultations for love problems, business decisions, or finding lost property commanded premium prices because the stakes were higher. Some fortune tellers even offered ongoing arrangements. For a monthly fee, you could have unlimited consultations. It was essentially a subscription model centuries before anyone called it that. And wealthy clients, particularly women who form close relationships with their readers, sometimes paid these retainers for years. There are documented cases of fortune tellers being consulted on major business decisions. Should I invest in this venture? Should I hire this person? Should I expand into this market? And the fortune teller would consult her cards or stars and render judgment. If the business succeeded, she got credit and more referrals. If it failed, well, fate is unpredictable, is it not? The client should have been more careful how they interpreted the signs. It was in many ways no different from modern consulting. People pay enormous fees to have consultants analyze data and make predictions about market trends, consumer behavior, business prospects. Is that so different from paying someone to read tarot cards? Both are attempting to reduce uncertainty. Both are giving the client permission to make a decision. Both are selling confidence disguised as knowledge. Here is something that fascinates me: the repeat customer model. Fortune-telling businesses thrived on people coming back again and again, not because the predictions were always accurate, but because the relationship itself became valuable. The fortune teller became a confidant, a counselor, someone who knew your secrets and would not judge you for them. Women especially form these long-term relationships with their readers. According to contemporary research, women maintain relationships with personal fortune tellers far more often than men do. Why? I think it is because these sessions offered something rare: a safe space to talk about your real fears, your real desires, your real life without the social performance required everywhere else. Your fortune teller did not care if you were a proper lady. She did not care if you had unacceptable thoughts or inappropriate desires. She had heard it all. And in that space of non-judgment, you could be honest. You could ask the questions you were not supposed to ask. You could admit the things you were not supposed to feel. That had value, enormous value, worth paying for week after week, year after year. And for the fortune teller, it meant steady income, it meant security, it meant being able to plan for the future, which is ironic, is it not? The woman who sold futures to others could finally afford a future of her own. But there was a shadow side to this economic success. The more successful a fortune teller became, the more attention she attracted from jealous competitors, from moral reformers, from authorities who saw her wealth as evidence of fraud. Because how could an honest woman make that much money? Surely she must be deceiving people. Surely it was all lies. And sometimes, yes, it was lies. Let us not romanticize this. There were frauds. There were fortune tellers who deliberately manipulated vulnerable people, extracting money through fear and false promises. There were scams. There were cons. Just like in any industry, some practitioners were unethical. But the assumption that all successful fortune tellers must be frauds? That reveals the bias, does it not? Men could build fortunes through speculation, gambling, business ventures that failed more often than they succeeded. But a woman making money by providing counsel and comfort and a sense of meaning? That was automatically suspicious. The double standard was breathtaking, and it still exists. Even today, when people talk about fortune telling, they often use words like scam and fraud and deception. But when they talk about life coaches, therapists, business consultants, motivational speakers, those are legitimate professions. Yet they are all doing fundamentally similar things, helping people make sense of their lives and make decisions about the future. The difference is mostly about who controls the narrative, about who gets to claim legitimacy and who gets dismissed as a charlatan. As we move deeper into this story, we are about to encounter something truly wild. We are going to explore how Christianity, the very religion that condemned fortune-telling as demonic, ended up embracing certain female prophets as saints and visionaries. We are going to see how the same gift that got some women burned at the stake got other women canonized as holy, and we are going to discover that the line between prophecy and heresy was often just a matter of who was listening and whether they liked what they heard. The contradictions are astonishing, the hypocrisy is stunning, and the stories are absolutely captivating. So take a breath, let these tales of wealth and power settle, and prepare yourself for the sacred paradox at the heart of our story. Contradictions fascinate me, especially the kind that reveal how flexible human beings are with their principles when it suits them. And nowhere is this more apparent than in how Christianity dealt with women who claim to see the future. On one hand, the Bible explicitly forbids divination. Deuteronomy 27 verse 10 says, "You shall not practice divination or tell fortunes." Leviticus 19 verse 31 warns against mediums and necromancers. The message is clear. Trying to see the future through occult means is forbidden. It is ungodly, it is dangerous, and yet, walk into the Sistine Chapel in Rome, one of the most sacred spaces in all of Christianity, and look up. What do you see? Painted by Michelangelo himself between 1508 and 1512, you will find 5 sibyls, pagan prophetesses, women who supposedly received their visions from Apollo, not the Christian god. Right there on the ceiling, alternating with the great prophets of the Old Testament. The Delphic Sibyl, the Libyan Sibyl, the Persian Sibyl, the Cumaean Sibyl, the Erythraean Sibyl. How did this happen? How did pagan fortune-tellers end up honoured in the holiest of Christian spaces? The answer reveals something profound about power, about control, and about the impossible position Christianity found itself in when confronting female spiritual authority. Let us start with the medieval hymn Dies Irae, which means Day of Wrath. This hymn, written in the 13th century, describes the Day of Judgment, the Apocalypse, the end of all things. And here is what it says, translated from the Latin, Day of Wrath, that day when the world dissolves into ash, as foretold by David and the Sibyl, a Hebrew king and a pagan prophetess, given equal weight as witnesses to Christian truth. The Sibyl is presented as being just as reliable a prophet as King David himself, in a Christian hymn, sung in churches for centuries. This is not a minor detail. This is the church saying, yes, these pagan women saw the truth. Yes, their prophecies were valid. Yes, they knew things that came from God, even though they lived before Christ and worshipped other gods. Why would Christianity do this? Why embrace these ancient prophetesses when the religion explicitly condemned fortune-telling? The answer is both simple and complex. Simple, because the Sibyls were too influential to ignore. Their prophecies had shaped Greek and Roman culture for 1,000 years. Everyone knew about them, everyone believed in them. When Christianity spread through the Roman Empire, trying to convert people who had grown up venerating the Sibyls, the church faced a choice. They could say the Sibyls were all lies, all deception, all demonic. But then they would lose credibility, because people knew the Sibyls had predicted true things. Or they could claim the Sibyls, reinterpret them, say that these pagan women were actually, unknowingly, prophesying about Christ. They chose the second option. It was brilliant strategy, really. Instead of fighting the Sibyls, they absorbed them. The Tiburtine Sibyl, for instance, was credited with a prophecy that medieval Christians believed foretold the birth of Jesus. The story goes that the Roman Emperor Augustus, at the height of his power, asked the Sibyl whether anyone greater than him would ever exist. She supposedly had a vision of the Virgin Mary holding the Christ child and told Augustus that yes, a greater one was coming. Did this actually happen? Almost certainly not, but it did not matter. What mattered was that Christians could point to this story and say, "See, even the pagans knew Christ was coming. Even their prophets spoke of our God." This made Christianity seem inevitable, predestined, woven into the very fabric of history, and so the Sibyls were Christianized. Their images appeared in medieval manuscripts, in stained glass windows, in cathedral sculptures. They were painted alongside saints. They were quoted by theologians. Saint Augustine himself, one of the most important early Christian thinkers, referenced the Sibylline prophecies in his work, The City of God, written around 426 in the Common Era. But here is where it gets really interesting. While the Church was celebrating these ancient pagan prophetesses, it was simultaneously persecuting contemporary Christian women who claimed prophetic gifts. The contradiction is staggering. Let me tell you about Hildegard of Bingen, a Benedictine abbess who lived from 1098 to 1179. Hildegard experienced visions from a very young age. She saw lights, received messages, heard divine voices, and she wrote them down. She composed theological works, medical texts, music, all based on what she claimed God revealed to her. Now, Hildegard was lucky in several ways. She was a nun, which gave her some protection. She was well connected, with supporters among the powerful, and she was very, very careful about how she presented her visions. She did not claim personal power. She positioned herself as merely a vessel, a flawed, unworthy woman through whom God chose to speak despite her unworthiness. This humility, whether genuine or strategic, saved her. The Church investigated her visions and eventually declared them legitimate. Pope Eugenius III gave his approval. Hildegard became Saint Hildegard, a doctor of the Church celebrated for her spiritual gifts. But what about the women who were not so careful? What about the women who claimed prophetic authority without the protection of a convent, without powerful supporters, without the right political connections? They were often declared heretics, witches, possessed by demons rather than inspired by God. The exact same gift, the exact same experience of seeing visions and speaking prophecies could make you a saint or get you burned alive depending on who believed you and whether you had the right endorsements. Joan of Arc is perhaps the most famous example of this cruel arbitrariness. She heard voices, saints, she said, Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, Saint Margaret. They told her to lead France against the English, and she did. She put on armour, led armies, achieved impossible victories. She was 17 years old. For a while she was celebrated, a miracle, a gift from God. But when the political winds shifted, when she was captured by enemies, suddenly those voices were reinterpreted. Now they were demonic. Now she was a heretic, a witch. She was tried by the Church and burned at the stake in 1431 at the age of 19. 25 years later, the Church reversed its position. Oops, we made a mistake. She was actually a martyr and a saint. They declared her innocent. Centuries later, in 1920, she was canonized, but she was still dead, still executed by the very institution that would later claim to honor her. The message was clear. Women could have prophetic gifts, but only if the Church controlled the narrative, only if the prophecies supported the right people, only if the woman was humble enough, submissive enough, politically useful enough. Meanwhile, the ancient Sibyls, dead for over 1,000 years, could be celebrated freely because they posed no threat. They could not challenge church authority. They could not lead armies or inspire followers. They were safely in the past, their prophecies reinterpreted to support Christianity rather than challenge it. But here is something beautiful that emerged from this mess. Despite the dangers, despite the contradictions, Christian women throughout the medieval period continued to claim prophetic gifts. They continued to have visions. They continued to speak with authority about spiritual matters. And some of them created spaces of genuine female power within the rigid structures of the church. Let me introduce you to Julian of Norwich, an anchoress who lived in 14th century England. In 1373, when she was about 30 years old, she became gravely ill. She nearly died, and during this illness, she experienced a series of 16 visions, which she called showings, depicting the passion of Christ and revealing deep theological truths about the nature of God's love. Here is what makes Julian remarkable. She wrote about these visions in English, not Latin. She made theology accessible to ordinary people. And she presented God in both masculine and feminine terms, referring to Jesus as mother, describing divine love in nurturing, maternal language. This was radical, this was subversive, and she got away with it. Why? Because she was enclosed as an anchoress, living in a tiny cell attached to a church devoted to prayer and contemplation. She was not out in the world preaching, not challenging church hierarchy openly. She was contained. And from that contained space, she wrote words that would influence Christian mysticism for centuries. God is our mother as truly as God is our father, she wrote. This is the language of someone who understood that the divine transcends human categories, including gender. Coming from a woman in the 14th century, this is extraordinary. Or consider Marjorie Kempe, who lived from around 1373 to 1438. Marjorie was not a nun. She was a married woman, a mother of 14 children, a merchant's wife, and she started having mystical visions and experiences that she believed were from God. She wept loudly during church services. She claimed to have conversations with Jesus, with Mary, with various saints. People thought she was insane, or demon-possessed, or faking it for attention. She was investigated multiple times by church authorities, interrogated, suspected of heresy. But she had powerful defenders, including Julian of Norwich, whom she visited seeking advice. And ultimately, she was allowed to continue her religious life, her pilgrimage, her mystical experiences. Marjorie dictated her spiritual autobiography, the Book of Marjorie Kempe, which is considered the first autobiography in English. In it, she describes her spiritual journey with startling honesty, including her struggles with sexuality, her bargaining with God, her moments of doubt and fear. She does not present herself as a perfect saint. She presents herself as a real, complicated woman trying to understand her relationship with the divine. The church tolerated her barely. She was too loud, too uncontrolled, too female, but she persisted. And her book survived, giving us a window into what medieval women's spirituality actually looked like when it was not being filtered and sanitized by male authorities. Now, what do these Christian mystics have to do with fortune tellers? Everything. Because they are the acceptable version of the same phenomenon. Both Christian mystics and fortune tellers claimed access to hidden knowledge. Both received visions, both spoke with authority about things ordinary people could not see. Both counseled people about their lives and futures. The difference was framing. If you said your visions came from God and you submitted to church authority, you might be celebrated as a mystic or prophet. If you said your visions came from the stars or spirits or your own psychic gift and you operated independently, you were a fortune teller, a witch, a heretic. Same gift, different packaging, completely different consequences. And the church knew this. That is why they worked so hard to control female prophecy, to channel it into acceptable forms. Convents, anchor holds, approved devotional practices. Women could have spiritual authority, but only within very specific boundaries. Step outside those boundaries, and you faced accusation, trial, possibly death. Yet women kept stepping outside. They kept claiming the right to speak with divine authority. They kept insisting that God spoke to them directly, without need for male intermediaries. This is one of the great stories of resistance in medieval Christianity. Women using the language of faith to claim power the culture otherwise denied them. There is something deeply ironic about the fact that Christianity, a religion that often restricted women's roles severely, also provided one of the few spaces where female authority could be claimed and recognized. If you could convince people that God was speaking through you, suddenly your gender mattered less. Suddenly you had a platform, a voice, influence. Of course it was dangerous. Of course it required careful navigation of political and theological minefields, but for some women that risk was worth it, because the alternative was silence, invisibility, a life defined entirely by the men around you. I think about this whenever I hear people dismiss fortune tellers or mystics or anyone who claims special spiritual knowledge, because underneath the skepticism, underneath the accusations of fraud, there is often an unspoken question. Who gave you the right? Who gave you, a woman, the authority to speak about matters of ultimate importance? And the answer these women gave, whether they were sibyls, mystics, or fortune tellers, was always the same. The divine did. The universe did. Truth itself did. You do not get to gatekeep what I know or how I know it. That is power. Dangerous, subversive, revolutionary power. No wonder the authorities tried so hard to control it, to channel it, to stamp it out when they could not control it. As we move forward in this journey, we are about to encounter the darkest chapter of all. We are going to talk about what happened when the church and secular authorities decided they had had enough of women claiming mysterious knowledge and spiritual power. We are going to explore the witch hunts, the trials, the burnings. We are going to see how the line between cunning woman and witch became a noose, and we are going to witness how women who had helped their communities for generations suddenly found themselves accused of the most terrible crimes imaginable. It is a hard story, a brutal story, but it is essential to understanding why fortune-telling became so dangerous, and why women paid such a terrible price for their gifts. So steady yourself. The light is about to get dimmer. The story is about to get darker. But we will walk through it together. Sometimes the line between honoured and hunted is so thin you can cross it without even knowing. One day you are the wise woman everyone turns to for help. The next day you are accused of congress with demons. One day your healing herbs are miracles. The next day they are evidence of witchcraft. One day you are necessary. The next day you are burning. How did this happen? How did the cunning folk, the healers, the fortune-tellers who had served their communities for generations suddenly become enemies? How did the same skills that once earned gratitude and payment start earning accusations and death sentences? The answer is complicated, dark, and reveals something terrible about what happens when fear meets power, when misogyny meets religious fervour, when economic anxiety finds a convenient scapegoat. Let me take you to England in 1541. King Henry VIII is on the throne. He has just broken from the Catholic Church, declared himself head of the Church of England, dissolved the monasteries. The country is in religious and political chaos. People are frightened, uncertain, looking for explanations for why everything feels so unstable. And Henry passes a law, the Witchcraft Act of 1541. It makes it a felony to use, devise, practice, or exercise any invocations, conjurations of sprites, witchcrafts, enchantments, or sorceries to the intent to get or find money or treasure, or to waste, consume, or destroy any person in his body. members or goods, or to provoke any person to unlawful love. Notice what is in that law: finding treasure, love spells, harming people through magic. But also notice what is not explicitly in it: healing magic, protective charms, divination to find lost property. The law targets harmful witchcraft specifically, but the language is vague enough that it could be interpreted broadly, very broadly. The law was actually repealed by 1547, just 6 years later. Historians believe this happened because those in power realized the death penalty was too harsh, or because they thought these were moral issues for the church rather than the state. But the damage was done. The precedent was set. Magic, especially magic practiced by women, was now something that could be criminalized. Under Queen Elizabeth I, who reigned from 1558 to 1603, a new law was established. This one created a series of punishments for repeat offenders: fines, imprisonment, and yes, death. The authorities were tightening the noose, but here is the fascinating contradiction. Astrologers and fortune-tellers were still familiar figures at Tudor courts. The same monarchs who passed laws against witchcraft consulted with their own pet astrologers and seers. Queen Elizabeth herself had her court astronomer and astrologer John Dee, whom she trusted deeply. He cast horoscopes for her, advised her on auspicious dates for important events, and practiced what most people would call magic. So why was his magic acceptable while the village cunning woman's was not? Because he was educated, male, connected to power. His magic was framed as natural philosophy, as learned inquiry, as scholarship. Her magic was folk practice, women's work, lower class. Same activities, different branding, completely different legal treatment. This is crucial to understand. The witch hunts were never really about magic. They were about who had the right to practice it. They were about controlling women, controlling the poor, controlling knowledge and power that existed outside official structures. Let me tell you about 3 women whose stories break my heart: Anne Baker, Joan Willamot, and Ellen Green. They were tried together in England in 1619. Accused of witchcraft. Their crime? They were cunning women who helped the Flower family, who themselves were accused of using magic. The trial records describe how these women allegedly aided in spells and divination. But when you read the actual accusations, they are almost laughably mundane. One of them kept a familiar spirit, supposedly, which took the form of a dog. Another had special knowledge of herbs. Another could find lost objects. These were not evil sorceresses. These were women doing what women in their position had done for centuries. But the context had changed, the fear had grown, and they became targets. Here is what haunts me. The common people, the ordinary villagers, generally made a clear distinction between cunning folk and witches. Cunning folk were helpful, they healed, they found things, they broke curses. Witches were harmful, they cursed, they destroyed, they worked malevolent magic. These were different categories in people's minds, but the educated elite, the authorities, the witch hunters, they did not recognize this distinction. To them, all magic was suspicious. All practitioners were potentially in league with the devil. And so the very women who had been protecting villages from witchcraft suddenly found themselves accused of being witches. It is perversely circular. You go to a cunning woman because you believe someone has cursed you. She performs a ritual to break the curse. But that ritual involves charms, herbs, spoken words, symbolic actions. To an outside observer, especially one predisposed to see evil, her magic looks no different from the supposed curse she is breaking. She is using the same tools, the same language. How can the authorities tell good magic from bad magic? Simple. They cannot. So they decide it is all bad. Women were the primary targets of witch accusations, not exclusively, Men were accused too, but the vast majority of those executed for witchcraft were women, and they fit certain profiles: elderly widows, young women who had not married, healers and midwives, women who mixed herbal medicines and offered folk remedies, women who lived alone or seemed odd or did not conform to social expectations. Being old and female was dangerous. Being knowledgeable about plants was dangerous. Being independent was dangerous. Having a sharp tongue or showing anger when mistreated was dangerous. Basically, being a woman who did not make herself small and agreeable could get you killed. And here is the economic angle that rarely gets discussed. Most of the women accused of witchcraft were poor. They were the ones who could not afford to pay for their own defense. They were the ones who had no powerful protectors. They were vulnerable, and vulnerability made them targets. But there is another economic factor too. Some historians have argued that the witch hunts represented a concerted effort to drive women out of healthcare as medicine was professionalizing and becoming a male-dominated field. For centuries, women had been the primary healthcare providers in their communities. They attended births. They created remedies. They cared for the sick. But as universities began training physicians, all male of course, because women could not attend universities, there was suddenly competition. And what better way to eliminate competition than to criminalize it? If you can convince people that the wise woman's remedies are actually devil's work, that her successful births are the result of pacts with demons, that her knowledge is dangerous and ungodly, you can drive her out of practice. You can force people to go to the expensive university-trained male physician instead. Is this what happened? It is debated. Some historians say yes, this was a campaign to professionalize medicine at women's expense. Others say no, it was more about religious paranoia and social control than economic competition. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Multiple factors working together, all of them targeting women with knowledge and independence. There is a documented case from 1613 that illustrates the impossible position these women found themselves in. A wise woman named Barbara Barbier in Saint-Nicolas, Lorraine, France, was asked by a neighbour to provide a remedy. But Barb was reluctant. She knew it was dangerous. Other women in her profession had recently gone on trial for witchcraft. She knew that helping could get her accused, but the neighbour begged, pleaded, and Barb's compassion, her desire to help, overcame her fear. She provided the remedy. And then, when things did not go as expected, when the patient did not improve as hoped, guess who got blamed? Barb was accused of witchcraft. Her act of kindness became evidence against her. This is the trap. If you refuse to help, you are cold, suspicious, possibly evil. If you help and it goes well, you must have used magic, which means you are dangerous. If you help and it goes badly, you deliberately caused harm through witchcraft. There is no winning. The game is rigged, and the evidence used against accused witches would be laughable if it were not so tragic. Birthmarks were considered marks of the devil. Unusual spots on the skin, moles, scars, the shape of your hand could betray you. Remember, palmistry was associated with fortune-telling, and during the witch trials, unusual lines on your palm could be used as proof of a satanic pact. They would search accused women's bodies for the witch's mark, a supposedly insensitive spot where the devil had touched them. They would prick the woman all over with needles looking for a place that did not hurt or did not bleed. Can you imagine being stripped, humiliated, tortured in the name of finding proof of something that did not exist? If you had a pet that was unusually affectionate, that could be a familiar spirit. If you muttered to yourself, you were casting spells. If you looked at someone angrily and then they got sick, you had cursed them. If you were old and ugly, you fit the stereotype. If you were young and beautiful, you were using glamour magic to seduce. You could not win. The accusations were designed to be impossible to disprove. And here is something that chills me to the bone. The witch hunts created a self-perpetuating economy of fear. Professional witch hunters emerged, travelling from town to town offering their services. They would be paid for each witch they found. So naturally, they always found witches. Their income depended on it. Some of these witch hunters were con artists who knew exactly what they were doing. They would torture confessions out of vulnerable women, then collect payment and move to the next town. Others genuinely believed they were doing God's work, rooting out evil. In some ways, the true believers were more dangerous than the charlatans because you could not reason with them. They were righteous, certain, convinced that every scream of pain from the torture chamber was actually a demon being driven out. The methods of torture were designed to produce confessions, sleep deprivation, starvation, being forced to walk until your feet bled, having heavy stones placed on your chest, being stretched on racks, and the actual burning was often the merciful end after weeks or months of agony. Some women were strangled before burning as an act of mercy. Others were burned alive. The smell of burning flesh would fill the town square while crowds watched, some horrified, some jeering, children playing at the edges of the gathering as if it were a festival. How many died? Estimates vary wildly. Some historians say 40,000 to 60,000 were executed across Europe during the height of the witch hunts from roughly 1450 to 1750. Others say the number could be as high as 100,000 or more. We will never know the true count because many trials were not recorded, many deaths were not documented. What we do know is that entire communities were decimated of their wise women, their healers, their cunning folk. The knowledge they carried, passed down through generations, was lost, burned with them, the herbs and remedies, the techniques and practices, gone. And the fear lingered long after the execution stopped. Women learned to hide their knowledge, to deny their abilities, to make themselves small and unremarkable, to never ever stand out or claim special knowledge, or help too effectively, because effectiveness bred suspicion. This trauma, this collective memory of persecution, shaped how women approached power and knowledge for centuries afterward. It taught them that being visibly competent was dangerous, that helping people could get you killed, that the same community you served could turn on you in an instant. But here is what the witch hunters could not kill: the need. People still got sick, crops still failed, loved ones still went missing. The future was still terrifying and unknown. And so even during the witch hunts, even when it was most dangerous, women continued to practice. They just got better at hiding it, more careful about who they helped, more secretive about their methods. The fortune tellers and cunning folk went underground. They stopped advertising, stopped being visible. They worked by word of mouth in hidden corners with trusted clients only. The practice did not die, it just became invisible. And in that invisibility, in that enforced secrecy, something was preserved. The knowledge survived. The traditions continued, quietly, dangerously, defiantly. Because here is the thing about trying to destroy something that meets a genuine human need. You cannot. You can drive it underground. You can make it illegal. You can execute practitioners. But as long as people are desperate, as long as people are suffering, as long as people need hope and help and answers, someone will rise to meet that need, no matter the risk. The witch hunts ended eventually. Society moved on, became more rational, more enlightened. The laws changed, the executions stopped, but the memory remained. And the women who carried this knowledge forward carried it with caution, with secrecy, with an understanding that what they knew could save lives or end their own. In our next section, we're going to explore the actual books, the grimoires and magical texts that some of these women secretly studied, despite the mortal danger. We are going to discover the forbidden knowledge that was supposed to be kept from women entirely, and how some of them accessed it anyway. We are going to see how literacy itself became a form of magical power, and how the written word could be both salvation and damnation. The story of these secret books is absolutely fascinating, and it is going to change how you think about knowledge, power, and who gets to claim them. So take a breath, let the weight of these losses settle, and prepare yourself for the hidden libraries, the secret texts, the forbidden knowledge that women were never supposed to touch. Knowledge has always been power, and those in power have always known this, which is why throughout history certain knowledge has been carefully guarded, deliberately hidden, explicitly forbidden to specific groups of people. Women were not supposed to read Latin. Women were not supposed to study theology. Women were not supposed to have access to medical texts or philosophical treatises. And women were absolutely positively not supposed to possess grimoires, those mysterious books of magical knowledge that promised power over spirits, nature, and fate itself. But of course, some women did anyway, because forbidden fruit has always been the sweetest, because power calls to those who have been denied it, because if you tell someone they cannot have something, you guarantee they will want it. Tonight, we are going to explore the secret libraries of cunning women, the books they hid, the knowledge they risked everything to obtain, the words they were never supposed to read. And we're going to discover something ironic, something almost funny if it were not so revealing. One of the books that authorities used to condemn magical practitioners became the very textbook those practitioners used to learn their craft. Let me tell you about a book published in 1584 by a man named Reginald Scot. It was called The Discovery of Witchcraft, and Scott's stated purpose was to debunk magic, to expose cunning folk and magical practitioners as frauds and charlatans. He wanted to reveal all their tricks, all their methods, all their supposed secrets so that people would stop being deceived. So what did Scott do? He described in meticulous detail hundreds of magical practices, how to create protective amulets, how to perform divination rituals, how to cast circles, how to invoke spirits, how to create talismans, how to read signs in nature, how to prepare magical oils and incenses, page after page after page of instruction. He thought he was exposing fraud. Instead, he created the most comprehensive magical instruction manual of his era. Cunning folk read it eagerly. They used it as a textbook. The very book meant to destroy their credibility became their grimoire, their guide, their source of new techniques to try. And here is the delicious irony. Scott meant well. He genuinely thought magical practices were nonsense and that by explaining how they were done, he would strip away their mystique. But what he did not understand is that it does not matter if something works through supernatural power or through psychology and theatre. If it helps people, if it meets their needs, if it gives them hope or healing or answers, they will use it. The mechanism is less important than the result. Court records from the centuries following Scott's publication show cunning folk being caught with copies of The Discovery of Witchcraft. It was used as evidence against them. Look, the authorities would say, this person possesses a book about witchcraft. Clearly they are practicing dark arts. Never mind that the book was written specifically to debunk those arts. Possession was enough for suspicion. But Scott's book was not the only text circulating among magical practitioners. There were older grimoires, some dating back centuries, manuscripts copied by hand and passed secretly from teacher to student. And here is where it gets fascinating. Many of these texts were written in Latin, the language of the church and educated men. Women were not supposed to know Latin. Most could not read at all. Literacy rates for women in medieval and early modern Europe were abysmal, often below 10%. But the women who became cunning folk, who built practices serious enough to support themselves. Many of them taught themselves to read, or found someone to teach them, because they understood that written knowledge was power, that the person who could read the grimoire had an advantage over the person who could only rely on oral tradition. Think about what that means. A peasant woman, barred from formal education, teaching herself Latin in secret so she could read magical texts. That is not just determination, that is hunger. Hunger for knowledge, hunger for power, hunger for something more than the narrow life society offered her. Some grimoires had titles that sound like they came straight from fantasy novels. The Key of Solomon, The Lesser Key of Solomon, The Sacred Magic of Abramelin the Mage, The Sworn Book of Honorius, The Picatrix. These texts claim to contain the secrets of ancient wise men, techniques for summoning angels or demons, methods for divining the future, formulas for creating powerful talismans. Were they real? Did they work? Well, that depends on what you mean by work. If you mean could you summon a demon to do your bidding by following the instructions precisely, probably not. But if you mean could these texts provide a structured framework for ritual practice that gave people psychological access to their own intuition and willpower, that helped them feel empowered and in control of their circumstances, then yes, absolutely. The rituals in these grimoires were complex. They required preparation, focus, concentration. You had to gather specific materials at specific times. You had to fast or pray or meditate. You had to draw symbols, speak invocations, perform actions in precise order. All of this created a mental state of heightened awareness and intention. And here is what modern psychology tells us. Ritual works. Not because it summons supernatural entities, but because it focuses the mind, creates psychological commitment, and helps people access parts of themselves they normally cannot reach. An athlete performs pre-game rituals not because the rituals are magic, but because they help the athlete get into the right mental state. Same principle. The cunning folk who studied these grimoires were doing sophisticated psychological work, even if they did not call it that. They were learning how to create transformative experiences for their clients, how to make the ordinary feel sacred, how to make invisible things feel tangible. But possessing these books was dangerous. If the authorities found a grimoire in your home, it could be used as evidence that you were practicing forbidden magic. So women hid them, in false bottoms of trunks, in holes dug beneath floorboards, in chimneys, wrapped in cloth and buried in gardens. The same way people in authoritarian regimes have always hidden forbidden books, and some women could not risk possessing physical books at all, so they memorized. They committed entire rituals to memory. They learned charms and invocations by heart. They turned their own minds into libraries that could not be searched, could not be seized, could not be burned. There is something beautiful and tragic about that. Knowledge so dangerous you cannot write it down. So precious you must carry it inside yourself always, ready to pass it on before you die, so it does not die with you. Let me tell you about one specific type of text that cunning women used. Books of Hours. These were Christian devotional books containing prayers, psalms, and meditations for the different times of day. They were common, acceptable, not suspicious at all. Many literate women owned them, but here is the clever part. Some cunning women would add extra pages to their books of hours, pages containing charms, herb lore, divination techniques, magical formulas. To a casual observer flipping through, it looked like a normal prayer book, but tucked between prayers to the Virgin Mary might be instructions for creating a love charm. Between psalms might be a list of herbs and their magical properties. It was hiding in plain sight, using the acceptability of Christian devotion as camouflage for practices the Church condemned. And it worked because people did not look too closely. A woman with a prayer book was pious, harmless, not worth investigating. The intersection of Christianity and magic in these texts is fascinating. Many magical charms and spells invoke Jesus, Mary, and the saints. They use prayers, holy water, blessed objects. The practitioners did not see a contradiction. To them, they were calling on divine power to help people. Whether you called that magic or miracles depended entirely on who was doing the calling and who had given permission. There were also collections of what we might call folk medicine texts, herbals that described plants and their uses. Some of these were fairly straightforward. This herb reduces fever, that one helps with digestion. But others ventured into more magical territory. This plant picked at midnight under a full moon will grant visions, that root carried in your pocket will attract love. Nicholas Culpeper published The Complete Herbal in 1653, a comprehensive guide to medicinal plants. It became hugely popular and many cunning folk used it, but Culpeper also included astrological associations for each plant, recommending harvesting and preparation based on planetary positions. So it was simultaneously a medical text and an astrological one, blending the supposedly rational with the supposedly superstitious. This blending was typical. In the minds of most people during this era, there was no hard line between medicine and magic, between prayer and spell, between natural remedy and supernatural intervention. It all existed on a spectrum. The wise woman used whatever worked, drawing from Christian tradition, folk magic, herbal knowledge, and ritual practice without worrying about whether modern people would categorize these things differently. Now here is something I find endlessly interesting. Many grimoires contained elaborate instructions for creating a magic circle, a protected space within which the magical practitioner would work. You would mark out the circle with chalk or salt, inscribe specific symbols at cardinal points, invoke protection from angels or divine forces, and only then begin your actual working. Why? The stated reason was to protect yourself from any spirits or demons you might summon. But I think there was another reason, equally important. The circle created sacred space. It marked a boundary between ordinary reality and the space where extraordinary things could happen. Psychologically, it gave the practitioner permission to enter a different mode of consciousness, to believe differently, to see differently, and for women especially, that circle might have been the only space in their entire lives where they were fully in control, where they had authority, where their word was law. Inside that circle, they were not servants or daughters or wives, they were magicians, priestesses, wielders of power. The grimoires also often contained elaborate hierarchies of spirits, angels, and demons, long lists of names, attributes, symbols. The Key of Solomon describes 72 demons, each with specific powers and specific methods for summoning them. Other texts describe angels organized by celestial hierarchy, each governing different aspects of existence. To modern eyes, this looks like pure fantasy. But think about what these hierarchies really are. They are organizational systems for understanding invisible forces. They are ways of naming and categorizing the powers that shape our lives. Luck, fate, inspiration, fear, desire, love. These things are real forces, even if we do not personify them as angels and demons anymore. The grimoires were trying to map the invisible landscape of human experience and give practitioners tools for navigating it. And those tools required literacy, required study, required intellectual engagement with complex symbolic systems. The women who mastered grimoires were doing serious intellectual work, whether or not we want to call it scholarship. There is a reason why when authorities search the homes of accused witches, they look for books, any books, because a woman who could read was a woman who could learn things without permission, who could access knowledge meant to be kept from her, who could potentially become powerful enough to be dangerous. This is why education has always been such a battleground. This is why oppressive regimes burn books and close schools. Because knowledge is the most powerful magic there is. It transforms people. It gives them tools to question, to resist, to imagine alternatives to the way things are. The cunning women who secretly learn to read, who risked their lives to possess forbidden books, who memorized grimoires they could not safely own, they understood this. They knew that every word they learned made them more powerful. Every ritual they mastered gave them more options. Every charm they memorized was armor against a world that wanted them powerless. Some of the knowledge in these texts was practical, herbal remedies that actually worked, based on generations of observation, psychological techniques that helped people process trauma or make decisions, mnemonic devices for remembering important information. Some of it was probably nonsense. Superstition built on superstition, techniques that did nothing but waste time and materials, but all of it represented something crucial, the accumulation and transmission of women's knowledge. These books, these manuscripts, these carefully memorized charms were the library of an underground tradition. They were how women taught each other across generations when formal education was forbidden to them. And here is what moves me most. Despite everything, despite the burnings and the trials and the laws and the persecution, the knowledge survived. The books survived. Hidden, copied, memorized, passed down. Some of those grimoires from the 1500s and 1600s still exist in libraries and private collections today. You can read them. You can see the same words that some terrified cunning woman read by candlelight, wondering if possessing this book would cost her life. They took that risk. They paid that price, because knowledge was worth it. Power was worth it. The ability to help people, to practice a craft, to be something more than society said they could be, that was worth any risk. In our next part of this journey, we are going to explore what people actually wanted from fortune tellers. We are going to dig into the real questions that drove people to seek out these women, the desperations and desires that made them willing to pay, to risk association with suspected witches, to believe in magic. Because understanding what people wanted tells us everything about what they feared, what they hoped for, what they could not get anywhere else. The answers are going to surprise you. Some are tragic, some are touching, some are absolutely hilarious. So stay with me. Let these images of hidden books and secret knowledge settle in your mind, and prepare to hear the actual voices of the desperate and hopeful, asking their questions into the darkness, praying for answers. Listen closely now, because we're about to hear the actual voices of history. Not the voices of kings or theologians or scholars, but the voices of ordinary people whispering their desperate questions to women who promised answers. These voices reveal the raw, unfiltered desires and fears that have driven humans for centuries. They are touching, heartbreaking, sometimes absurd, and always, always deeply human. What did people actually ask fortune tellers? What were they willing to pay for? What secrets did they whisper in those darkened rooms, leaning across tables cluttered with cards or crystals or tea leaves? The answers are going to tell you more about the human condition than any philosophy book ever could. Let us start with the most requested service in the entire history of fortune-telling. Love magic, love spells, love potions, love charms, divination about romantic futures. This was the bread and butter of the fortune-telling business, then and now. People have always been desperate to control the most uncontrollable force in human experience, the human heart. Imagine you are a young woman in 16th century England. You love a man who does not seem to notice you, or he noticed you once but now his attention has wandered. You cannot directly court him because that would be improper. You cannot declare your feelings because society forbids it. You cannot control your own romantic destiny through any acceptable means. So what do? You go to the cunning woman, and you ask her to make him love you. The cunning woman has options. She might create a charm for you to carry, a small bag of herbs chosen for their supposed romantic properties. Roses for love, lavender for attraction, perhaps a lock of your hair tied with red thread. You wear this close to your heart and wait. Or she might prepare a potion, not a magical brew that will genuinely enchant someone against their will. That is fantasy. But a mixture you could slip into his drink, probably containing herbs known to relax inhibitions or create mild euphoria. Was this ethical? Absolutely not. Was it effective? Sometimes, in the sense that alcohol is effective. It lowered defenses, created opportunity. What happened after that was up to you. Or, and this was more common, the cunning woman might perform divination. She would look at your palm or lay out cards or gaze into a crystal and she would tell you things. She might describe your future husband, giving you details specific enough that you could identify him, but vague enough to fit multiple candidates. Tall, she might say, dark hair, kind eyes, works with his hands, good with animals. In a small village, how many men fit that description? Maybe 3 or 4. And suddenly you are paying attention to those 3 or 4 men in a new way. You smile at them, you find excuses to be near them, and because you are now actively pursuing connection, the chances of something developing increase dramatically. Is that magic? Or is that just giving someone permission to act on their desires? Court records from across Europe document women being prosecuted for providing love spells and potions. In 1597, a woman in London was accused of giving another woman a potion to make a man fall in love with her. The potion apparently contained herbs, wine, and disturbingly some of the woman's own menstrual blood. The belief was that by getting him to ingest something from her body, she would create a mystical connection. Gross? Yes. Effective? Probably not in the way she hoped. But the desperation behind it, the lengths someone will go to when they feel powerless in love, that is what gets me. She did not have Tinder. She did not have dating apps or social media or any modern way of expanding her romantic options. She had this one chance with this one man, and she was willing to try anything. Men sought love magic too, though they were often more interested in the sexual side of things. They wanted potions to increase their virility, charms to make them irresistible, spells to seduce specific women. The cunning folk who served male clients knew exactly what they were selling and charged accordingly. But love was not the only obsession. The second most common request? Money, finding treasure, locating lost wealth, ensuring business success, divining whether an investment would pay off. Throughout history, economic anxiety has driven people to seek supernatural guidance. In the medieval and early modern periods, the gap between comfort and destitution was terrifyingly thin. One bad harvest and your family starved. One failed business venture and you lost everything. One theft could destroy you. So people turned to cunning folk for help. If something valuable was stolen, you went to a cunning person. They would use various divination methods to identify the thief. Sometimes they would have the victim scry, looking into a reflective surface until they saw the culprit's face. Other times, the cunning person would cast a horoscope based on the moment of the theft, using astrology to determine direction, timing, and identity. Here is a specific example from court records. In 1625, a merchant in Yorkshire lost a substantial sum of money from his shop. He consulted a cunning man who told him that the thief was a person who lived northwest of the shop, had reddish hair, and would soon show signs of unusual spending. The merchant knew exactly one person who fit that description. He confronted them. They confessed. Did the cunning man really see this in the stars? Or did he use his knowledge of the merchant, the neighborhood, and human nature to make an educated guess? It does not matter. The merchant got his money back and the thief was caught. The magic worked. Finding lost objects was another common request. People lost things all the time: rings, coins, important documents, livestock that wandered off. And because they had no systematic way of searching, they turned to magic. The cunning person might use a pendulum, holding it over a map and watching where it swung. Or they might use a technique called dowsing, walking around with a forked stick that would supposedly dip when near the lost item. Does dowsing work? Modern science says no, the effect is caused by unconscious muscle movements. But those unconscious movements might be based on the dowser's actual observations and knowledge of the area. So in a weird way, dowsing might help you find things not because it is magic, but because it allows your subconscious knowledge to manifest physically. Then there were the darker requests, the ones that reveal the violence and pain in people's lives. Women came to cunning folk asking for protection from abusive husbands, asking for ways to end unwanted pregnancies, asking for revenge against people who had hurt them. This is where the line between cunning folk and accusations of witchcraft became most dangerous. If you helped a woman end a pregnancy, you could be accused of murdering a child through magic. If you gave someone a charm to protect them from an abuser and the abuser got hurt, you could be accused of cursing them. The same help that made you valuable made you vulnerable. Cunning folk also offered what we would now call medical consultations. People came with ailments, chronic pain, mysterious illnesses, fevers, coughs, skin conditions, whatever ailed them, and the cunning person would diagnose and treat. The diagnostic methods were a mix of observation, experience, and divination. Some cunning folk used urine reading, examining the colour, clarity, and even smell of urine to diagnose internal problems. This sounds ridiculous until you realize that modern medicine still uses urinalysis for diagnostics. They were onto something, even if their theoretical framework was wrong. Other practitioners used pulse diagnosis, feeling the rhythm and strength of the pulse in different parts of the body. This technique comes from traditional Chinese medicine and somehow made its way into European folk practice. Or they might cast a horoscope for the moment the person fell ill, using astrological timing to predict the course of the disease. The treatments ranged from sensible herbal remedies that actually work to absolute nonsense like the spider in a nut we talked about earlier. But here is the thing. Even the nonsense sometimes helped because of the placebo effect. If you believe a treatment will work, your body often responds as if it does. The mind's influence on healing is real and powerful. One category of questions that shows up repeatedly in historical records is about death. When will I die? Will my sick child survive? Is my aging parent going to recover? These are questions driven by grief and fear, and fortune tellers had to navigate them carefully. Most smart practitioners did not give specific death predictions because being wrong could destroy your reputation. If you said someone would die and they recovered, you looked like a fraud, or worse, you had cursed them. If you said they would recover and they died, you gave false hope and grieving families would blame you. So they learned to be vague. The cards show struggle ahead. The stars suggest a difficult period. Your mother's fate is in God's hands. These answers provided some framework for understanding suffering without making promises they could not keep. But sometimes people did not want vagueness. They wanted certainty, even if the certainty was terrible. There are documented cases of people paying fortune tellers specifically to tell them the worst, to confirm their darkest fears, because knowing felt better than uncertainty. I will lose him. Tell me when so I can prepare. She will not survive. Tell me how long we have so I can say goodbye. Fortune tellers who were genuinely compassionate must have found these consultations heartbreaking. What do you say to a parent whose child is dying? Do you give false hope? Do you speak the terrible truth? Do you deflect and comfort? There are no good options, only human ones. Then there were the bizarre requests, the ones that make you shake your head and laugh and feel a weird affection for the strangeness of your ancestors. Historical records preserve some truly odd consultations. A man in 1700 Germany consulted a cunning woman because his beer kept going sour, and he was convinced someone had cursed his brewery. She performed a ritual involving burning specific herbs in the brewery at midnight while reciting protective charms. Did it work? Well, he stopped having problems. Probably because he also, on her advice, cleaned his equipment more thoroughly and stored his beer in a cooler location. Magic and practical advice working together. A woman in 18th century France visited a fortune teller because she was convinced she had been transformed into a glass statue and would shatter if anyone touched her. The fortune teller, showing remarkable psychological insight, performed an elaborate ritual involving mirrors and chanting, then gently touched the woman and said, "See, you are flesh, not glass." The woman was cured. We would call that anxiety disorder now. The fortune teller called it enchantment. But the treatment worked. People asked about inheritances, about whether someone was lying to them, about whether to trust a business partner, about which of two choices to make, about whether their spouse was faithful, about whether they should take a journey, about whether a dream meant something, about whether the unusual behavior of an animal was an omen. They asked everything, anything, all the questions that plagued human hearts and minds and had no clear answers through conventional means. And here is what I find fascinating. The questions have not changed. Walk into a modern psychic's office and you will hear the same questions. Will I find love? Will I get the job? Should I trust this person? What does my future hold? Is my sick relative going to be okay? Should I take this opportunity? Same questions, same fears, same hopes. Separated by 400 years and answered by women using the same techniques their ancestors used. Tarot cards instead of reading tea leaves, maybe. Astrology apps instead of hand-drawn horoscopes. But the fundamental exchange is identical, because these are the questions that matter to people, not grand philosophical inquiries or abstract intellectual puzzles, but the intimate, immediate, desperate questions of daily life. Questions that conventional sources, religion, medicine, law, often cannot or will not answer satisfyingly. The fortune tellers stepped into that gap. They said, "Yes, I will sit with you in your uncertainty. Yes, I will help you imagine your future. Yes, I will give you tools to make sense of chaos. Yes, I will witness your fear and your hope, and I will not judge you for either." That is what people were really paying for. Not predictions necessarily, but presence, attention, a space where their questions mattered and their concerns were taken seriously. And the women who provided this service understood something profound about human psychology that we are only now, centuries later, starting to articulate clearly in therapeutic contexts. People do not always need answers. Sometimes they need permission. Permission to leave, permission to stay, permission to hope, permission to grieve, permission to act on what they already know in their hearts but are afraid to acknowledge. The fortune teller gave that permission. The cards say you should leave him. The stars show a new path opening. The crystal reveals that your instincts are correct. These statements allowed people to do what they already wanted to do, but felt they needed external validation to justify. Is that manipulation, or is that empowerment? I think it depends entirely on the practitioner's intentions and the client's autonomy. The best fortune tellers helped people access their own wisdom. The worst ones exploited vulnerability for profit, just like every other helping profession in history. In our next section, we are going to zoom out and look at the big picture. We are going to explore the impossible position these women occupied in society, revered and reviled, needed and feared, empowered and endangered all at once. We are going to examine the double-edged nature of their gift and ask the hard questions about what we mean by power, what we mean by freedom, and what price women paid for claiming both. This is where everything we have learned comes together, where all the threads weave into a pattern that reveals something profound about gender, knowledge, and survival. So stay close, keep your heart open, because this next part is going to make you see everything differently. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being needed and feared in equal measure, from knowing that people will come to your door in the dark, desperate for help, but cross the street to avoid you in daylight, from having power that everyone wants access to, but no one wants you to possess. This was the existence of the medieval fortune teller, the cunning woman, the wise woman, the seer. She lived in a state of perpetual contradiction, balanced on a knife's edge between reverence and accusation, between being essential and being expendable, between wielding genuine influence and being utterly vulnerable. Tonight, we need to talk about what it actually meant to live this life, not the romanticized version, not the sanitized historical narrative, but the raw, complicated reality of being a woman with power in a world designed to keep women powerless. Let us start with the economics again, because money reveals truth. We've already talked about women like Marie-Anne Lenormand who became wealthy through fortune-telling. But for every woman who struck it rich, there were hundreds who scraped by, earning just enough to survive, maybe a little better than they would have washing clothes or working in fields, but not by much. A cunning woman in a small village might charge a few pence for a simple palm reading, maybe a shilling for a more complex divination. If she was skilled and her reputation was good, she might earn enough to live independently, to have her own cottage, to eat regularly, to not depend on a husband or father or son for survival. Do you understand how radical that was? In an era when most women's economic options were marry, enter a convent, or starve, fortune-telling offered a third path, a way to support yourself through your own knowledge and skill, a way to live on your own terms. But that independence came with a cost. A woman living alone was automatically suspicious. A woman with money from unclear sources was even more so. A woman who did not need men was threatening to the entire social order. The village might need her, might rely on her, might come to her with all their problems and pay her for solutions, but they would never fully accept her. She would always be other, always be apart, always be the woman you consulted in secret but did not acknowledge in public. And that isolation had to have been crushing. Imagine helping someone through the death of their child, sitting with them in their grief, providing comfort and ritual and meaning, and then seeing them in the market the next day and having them pretend not to know you, having them turn away, having them whisper to their neighbour as you pass. You were good enough to help them in their darkest hour, but not good enough to greet openly in daylight. Some cunning women tried to build community with each other. There are records of networks, of practitioners who knew each other, shared techniques, referred clients to one another. But these networks had to be quiet, invisible, because gathering together would look like conspiracy, like a coven, and that word alone could get you killed. So mostly they worked alone, kept their knowledge to themselves, taught maybe one apprentice if they were lucky, and lived with the knowledge that when they died, much of what they knew would die with them. The psychological toll of this existence had to have been immense. You are providing a service people desperately need, but you can never fully claim credit or respect for it. You are solving problems that the official authorities, the doctors and priests and magistrates cannot solve, but you get no official recognition, no protection, no legitimacy. And always, always there is the fear, the knowledge that any day, any moment someone could accuse you, could point a finger and say which, and then everything you have built, everything you are, could be destroyed. Why would someone accuse you? The reasons are as varied as human malice. Maybe you refused to help them and they felt slighted. Maybe you helped their rival and they felt betrayed. Maybe you were too successful and someone was jealous. Maybe they owed you money and saw accusation as a way to avoid payment. Maybe they were genuinely frightened by your power. Maybe they were looking for a scapegoat for their own misfortunes and you were convenient. It did not take much. A whispered rumour, a suspicious neighbour, a child who claimed to have seen something strange, an animal dying at an inopportune moment, a storm on a day when you'd been heard muttering to yourself. These tiny things, meaningless coincidences, could become a death sentence. And once accused, you faced an impossible situation. The evidence against you was often your own skill. You healed people too effectively, so you must be using dark magic. You predicted things too accurately, so you must have demonic help. You lived too independently, so you must have made a pact with the devil in exchange for power. Your gifts became your crimes. The very things that made you valuable made you guilty. Let me share a specific case that illustrates this cruel irony. In 1651, a woman named Elizabeth Sawyer in Edmonton, England, was accused of witchcraft. Her neighbours said she cursed their livestock, caused their children to fall ill, spoiled their milk and beer. The evidence? She was old, poor, ugly and bad-tempered. She had arguments with people. She muttered to herself while walking. She owned a cat. That was it. That was the evidence. No one claimed she had helped them through magic. She was not a practicing cunning woman. She was just an angry old woman who did not hide her anger very well. And it was enough to condemn her. Elizabeth Sawyer was hanged. And here is the part that breaks my heart. In her final confession, extracted under pressure, she said she wished she had been a witch. She wished she had had the power people claimed she possessed. Because then at least her suffering would have had the meaning. At least her death would have been for something real. She died for a power she never had. Accused of crimes she never committed. Killed for failing to be properly meek and grateful for her lot in life. Now, imagine being a woman who actually did have power. Who actually could heal, could divine, could help people in ways that seemed magical. Living in a world where Elizabeth Sawyer was hanged for nothing, you knew that you could be hanged for something. You knew that your real abilities made you even more vulnerable than she was. So you had to be careful, so very careful. You had to help people, because that was how you survived economically, but not help them too much or too publicly. You had to have a reputation good enough to attract clients, but not so good that you attracted attention from authorities. You had to be visible enough to be found by those who needed you, but invisible enough to avoid persecution. It was a constant, exhausting balancing act, and the consequences of getting it wrong were death. But here is what amazes me. They did it anyway, despite the danger, despite the loneliness, despite the impossibility of it all. Women claimed this power. They practiced their craft. They helped their communities. They passed down their knowledge. They survived. Why? What drove them to take these risks? For some, it was economic necessity. It was this or destitution. When your choices are starve or practice magic, magic starts looking pretty good regardless of the risk. For others, it was genuine calling. They believed they had gifts that should be used, that their abilities were meant to help people, that denying their talents would be wrong. And for some, I think it was defiance. A refusal to accept the limitations society placed on them. A determination to live as fully as possible even in an impossible situation. If the world says you cannot have knowledge, have it anyway. If the world says you cannot have power, claim it anyway. If the world says you should be small and silent and obedient, be loud and complicated and difficult instead. This is courage, real courage. Not the battlefield kind where you fight and either win or die in glory, but the daily kind where you get up every morning knowing that today might be the day someone accuses you, and you do your work anyway. You help people anyway. You live your truth anyway. The price they paid for this courage was enormous. Beyond the risk of execution, there was the social cost. Most cunning women never married or married late and unhappily. Who wants to marry a woman with power? Who wants a wife that other people fear? Many had no children, or if they did, had to be careful about passing knowledge to daughters, because teaching them the craft meant putting them at risk too. Imagine having valuable knowledge and being afraid to share it with your own child because it might get them killed. Imagine that choice. The emotional cost had to be staggering. To never be able to fully relax. To always be performing a role, managing perceptions, trying to be helpful enough to be valued, but not so powerful as to be threatening. To have people come to you in crisis, accept your help, benefit from your gifts, and then abandon you the moment the crisis passes. Some women cracked under this pressure, became bitter, became the angry, cursing crones that stereotype depicts. And honestly, who can blame them? If you spend your life helping people who give you nothing but suspicion in return, bitterness seems like a reasonable response. But others maintained compassion, continued to help despite everything, found meaning in the work itself, regardless of how they were treated. These women humble me, their resilience, their continued generosity in the face of ingratitude and danger. That is heroism of the highest order. There is one more dimension of cost we need to talk about, the spiritual and psychological burden of the work itself. When you are the person everyone brings their problems to, you carry those problems. When you sit with grief, you absorb some of that grief. When you listen to fear, you take on some of that fear. Modern therapists talk about burnout, about compassion fatigue, about the emotional labor of caring for others. Fortune tellers experience this too, but without any of the support systems or professional boundaries therapists now have. No supervision, no peer support, no days off. The work was endless and the emotional weight must have been crushing. And yet, the tradition continued. Knowledge was passed down. Women kept claiming this dangerous power, generation after generation. What does that tell us? I think it tells us that the need to live fully, to use your gifts, to matter, to make a difference, that need is stronger than fear, stronger than persecution, stronger than the very real threat of death. It tells us that power, even dangerous power, even power that comes with an enormous price tag is worth having. Because the alternative, powerlessness, is a kind of death too, a slower death maybe, a quieter death, but death nonetheless. The women who practiced fortune-telling were choosing how they would die. Die slowly, invisibly, having never fully lived? Or die potentially violently, but having claimed your space, used your gifts, mattered to people, lived as fully as you possibly could? They chose the second option. They chose life, and even dangerous life, over safe death. And that choice, that courage, that refusal to be anything less than they were capable of being, that deserves our recognition, our respect, our gratitude. Because the knowledge they preserved, the traditions they maintained, the power they refused to relinquish, all of it came down to us. We have inherited their courage, their defiance, their insistence that women can know things, can see things, can speak with authority about the invisible and the future and the sacred. Every time a woman today claims expertise in a field that tries to exclude her, she is echoing these women. Every time a woman insists on her own knowing, her own authority, her own power, she is continuing this tradition. The tools have changed. The specific practices have evolved. But the fundamental act of a woman claiming power in a world that wants to deny her that power, that is the same. That thread runs unbroken through centuries. In our final section, we're going to bring this story into the present. We're going to trace how these medieval practices evolved into modern forms. We're going to see how fortune-telling survived, adapted, and actually grew stronger over the centuries despite everything that tried to destroy it. And we are going to ask ourselves what this whole journey teaches us about power, knowledge, belief, and the eternal human need for meaning and chaos. This is where we bring it all together, where we see the pattern complete, where we understand why this story matters, not just as history, but as something alive and relevant right now in your life, in our world. So breathe deep, feel the weight of all these stories, and walk with me into the final chapter. We have travelled a long road together tonight, from the marble temples of ancient Sibyls to the smoky cottages of medieval cunning women, from the gilded salons where Marie-Anne Lenormand advised empresses to the execution grounds where women burned for claiming the same gifts. We have seen power and persecution, wisdom and witch hunts, courage and terrible cost, and now we arrive here, now, 2025, an age of science and rationality and technology that can do things the medieval world could not even imagine. Surely in our modern enlightened era, fortune-telling is dead, right? Surely we have moved beyond such superstitious practices? Not even close. In fact, fortune-telling has never been more popular, never been more visible, never been more economically significant. The very practices that got women killed 400 years ago are now multi-billion-dollar industries. And women, still overwhelmingly women, are at the center of it all. Let me give you some numbers that will blow your mind. The psychic services industry in the United States alone is worth over $2 billion annually. $2 billion. People are spending that much money on tarot readings, astrology consultations, psychic hotlines, energy healings, and spiritual guidance. And that number has been growing, not shrinking, growing, despite scientific advancement, despite skepticism, despite all the rational arguments against believing in such things. The demand keeps increasing. Why? Same reasons as always: uncertainty, fear, the desperate human need for meaning and hope, and some sense that the universe has a plan. We have not evolved past these needs. We have just found new ways to address them. Walk into any bookstore and you will find entire sections dedicated to tarot, astrology, divination, spiritual guidance. Apps like CoStar and The Pattern, which provide astrological readings, have tens of millions of downloads. Tarot card sales have surged, especially among young women. There has been what journalists are calling a tarot renaissance, a massive resurgence of interest, particularly since around 2020. And here is what fascinates me. The language has changed, but the core practice has not. A medieval woman shuffling cards to divine someone's romantic future, and a modern woman pulling tarot cards to explore relationship dynamics are doing fundamentally the same thing. The tools are the same. The questions are the same. Even the archetypal images on the cards are the same. What has changed is the framing. Modern tarot readers often present their practice not as fortune-telling, but as self-reflection, as a tool for accessing intuition, as therapeutic exploration. They say things like, "The cards do not predict a fixed future. They help you examine possibilities and clarify your own thoughts." Does that sound familiar? It should, because that's exactly what the smartest cunning folk were always doing. They understood that the real magic was not in the cards or crystals or tea leaves. It was in creating a space where people could access their own wisdom, confront their own fears, imagine their own futures. The best modern practitioners are honest about this. They will tell you outright, "I am not reading your fate. I am reading the symbols with you, helping you interpret them in ways that illuminate your situation. It is collaborative. It is psychological. It is empowering rather than deterministic. But plenty of practitioners still claim actual psychic abilities, still insist they can see the future, communicate with spirits, channel divine messages, and people still believe them, still pay them, still seek them out in moments of crisis. Are they frauds? Some of them certainly, just like some medieval cunning folk were frauds, but others genuinely believe in their gifts, genuinely experience phenomena they interpret as psychic or spiritual, and still others are doing something more subtle. They have developed such refined observational skills, such deep intuition about human nature, that they seem psychic even if the mechanism is entirely psychological. Here is what I have learned studying this history. The question of whether psychic powers are real misses the point. What matters is whether the practice helps people, and for many people it genuinely does. A woman dealing with impossible grief finds comfort in a medium who claims to contact her dead husband. Whether the medium is really channeling spirits or is simply providing the closure and permission to heal that the woman needed, the help is real. The healing is real. A young person paralyzed by indecision pulls tarot cards and finds clarity about what they want to do. Whether that clarity came from supernatural guidance or from their own subconscious mind speaking through symbol and archetype, the breakthrough is real. The direction is real. An anxious person reads their horoscope and feels less alone in their struggles. Whether the stars actually influence human events or whether the broad archetypal language simply provides a framework for understanding, the comfort is real. The connection is real. I'm not saying we should abandon critical thinking. I'm not saying everything every psychic claims is true. What I'm saying is that these practices have survived for thousands of years because they meet genuine human needs. And dismissing those needs as mere superstition is both arrogant and historical. The modern resurgence of tarot and astrology is happening particularly among young women. Women in their 20s and 30s who are college-educated, scientifically literate, and perfectly capable of rational thought. They are not ignorant. They are not foolish. They are choosing these practices deliberately. Why? I think for the same reasons their medieval ancestors did. Because traditional authority structures, whether religious or scientific or medical, often fail to address their specific concerns. Because they want spiritual practices that center female wisdom and female authority. Because they want tools for self-understanding that do not require institutional gatekeepers. Tarot and astrology and modern witchcraft offer all of this. They are accessible. You do not need permission from any institution. You do not need a degree or ordination. You can learn from books, from the internet, from each other. And crucially, these traditions honor female lineages of knowledge. They connect you to centuries of women who practice these arts. That connection matters. When you shuffle a tarot deck, you are performing the same action countless women before you performed. When you read about the Sibyls, you are touching the same archetypes that inspired medieval mystics. When you claim the right to interpret spiritual symbolism for yourself, you are standing in a tradition of female spiritual authority that goes back millennia. This is why the witch aesthetic has become so popular in feminist circles. Not because people actually believe they are casting spells, necessarily, but because claiming the identity of witch is claiming the identity of a woman with power, a woman who was feared precisely because she could not be controlled, a woman who knew things, did things, mattered. When young women today call themselves witches, they are reclaiming a word that was used to destroy women like them. They are saying, "You called her a witch and burned her. You will not burn me." I claim that power anyway. It is an act of defiance, of remembrance, of solidarity across centuries, and it is working. The witch trials ended, but the archetype survived, and now, in an era when women are still fighting for full equality, for bodily autonomy, for the right to exist as complete human beings, That archetype of the powerful woman is resonating more strongly than ever. But let us talk about the shadow side too, because I would be dishonest if I pretended everything about modern fortune-telling is beautiful and empowering. There are still frauds, still people exploiting vulnerability for profit, still practitioners making claims they cannot support and taking money from people who cannot afford it. There are psychics who tell desperate people exactly what they want to hear in exchange for exorbitant fees. There are astrologers who create dependency rather than empowerment. There are spiritual advisors who manipulate clients into believing they are cursed and need expensive curse removal services. This happened in the medieval era too. Cunning folk who are more interested in profit than in helping, who played on fear, who extracted everything they could from vulnerable clients. Human nature has not changed. Where there is need, there will be people who exploit that need. So yes, skepticism has value. Critical thinking has value. Protecting vulnerable people from exploitation has value. But let us be careful that our skepticism does not become dismissal of all spiritual seeking, that our rationality does not become contempt for those who find meaning in practices we personally do not believe in. The story I have told you tonight is ultimately a story about women claiming power in a world that wanted to deny them that power, about women preserving knowledge despite persecution, about women helping each other across generations, passing down wisdom and technique and courage. That story has not ended. It continues. Right now, in tarot readers and astrologers and modern witches and spiritual counselors, in women who study ancient practices and adapt them for contemporary needs, in the millions of people, mostly women, who turn to these practices seeking meaning, seeking connection, and seeking some sense that their lives matter and the universe is not entirely random and cold. Are they finding truth? That depends on what you mean by truth. If you mean empirical, measurable, scientifically verifiable truth, then no, probably not. But if you mean truth in the sense of meaning, of narrative, of connection to something larger than themselves, then yes, absolutely yes. And maybe that is enough. Maybe that has always been enough. I think about the Sibyls on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, pagan prophetesses honoured in Christianity's holiest space. That contradiction, that impossible coexistence tells us something profound. It tells us that the human need for female spiritual authority is so strong that it survived even the most determined attempt to suppress it. The church could not erase the Sibyls. The witch hunters could not erase the cunning folk. Centuries of persecution could not kill the tradition. It shape-shifted. It went underground. It adapted. But it never died, because it meets a need that will not go away. The need to believe that someone, somewhere can see what we cannot, that the future is not entirely unknowable, that there is meaning in our suffering and purpose in our joy, that we are not alone in the terrifying darkness of existence. The fortune tellers, the seers, the wise women, they have always stepped into that darkness and said, "I will be your light. I will sit with you in uncertainty. I will help you imagine what comes next. I will witness your fear and your hope, and I will not turn away." That is the service. That is what people pay for. Not magic necessarily, but presence, compassion, the courage to help others navigate what cannot be fully known. And the women who provide this service today are walking in the footsteps of the Sibyls, of Lenormand, of Biddy Early, of the countless unnamed cunning women who practiced in secret, who risked everything, who preserved knowledge across generations. The tradition lives because they refuse to let it die. So whether you believe in fortune-telling or not, whether you think tarot is nonsense or treasure, whether you roll your eyes at astrology or check your horoscope religiously, I want you to remember the women behind these practices, the ones who were burned, the ones who were persecuted, the ones who practiced anyway, the ones who claimed power when claiming power could cost them everything. Remember them, honor them, recognize that your ability to explore spirituality on your own terms, to seek meaning wherever you find it, to claim knowledge and power and authority as a woman, that ability was purchased with their courage and their lives. We stand on their shoulders. We walk paths they carved. We breathe air they fought to make breathable. And maybe, just maybe, when we shuffle cards or read horoscopes or speak with confidence about things we cannot prove, we are channeling them, not in any supernatural sense, but in the very real sense that their defiance lives on in us. Their refusal to be silenced echoes in our voices. Their insistence on mattering ripples through everything we do. The hidden world of medieval fortune tellers was never really hidden. It was always there, just beneath the surface, waiting for those brave enough to see it. And now you have seen it. Now you know. The women who whispered the future shaped the present, and their whispers continue, if you listen closely, in the rustle of tarot cards, in the language of stars, in every woman who claims the right to know, to speak, to matter. Their story is our story. Their courage is our inheritance. Their power is our birthright. Never forget that. Thank you for walking this journey with me tonight. Thank you for listening to these stories, for honoring these women, for sitting with me in the darkness and the mystery and the magic of it all. I hope you have felt something, learned something, been changed even just a little by encountering these remarkable lives. If this story moved you, if these women mattered to you, if you want to explore more hidden histories and forgotten voices, stay with me. There are so many more stories to tell, so many more journeys to take, so many more mysteries waiting in the darkness. Until next time, may your own inner knowing guide you. May you trust your intuition as fiercely as the wise women trusted theirs. May you claim your power without apology. And may you always remember that you come from a long line of women who saw the future and refused to be silenced. Sleep well, dream deep, and know that in the morning you will wake with the courage of Sibyls running through your veins. Good night.